Picture a wealthy English physician's son, born in 1632, growing up in a country tearing itself apart over the question of who should hold power. John Locke watched his nation descend into civil war, saw a king beheaded, witnessed dictatorship and restoration. And through it all, he kept asking one question. What gives anyone the right to rule over another person? Now jump forward 2 centuries. A middle-class German boy, born in 1818, watches factory smoke blacken the skies of industrializing Europe. Karl Marx sees children working 16-hour days in textile mills, watches families starve while warehouse owners grow rich, and he asks a different question. Why do the people who do all the work own nothing, while those who own everything do no work? These 2 men never met. They lived in different centuries, faced different problems, and yet the debate between their ideas has shaped virtually every political argument you've ever heard. When people argue about healthcare, they're arguing about Locke and Marx. When they debate minimum wage, argue about taxes, discuss the role of government, they're standing on ground these 2 philosophers mapped out centuries ago. But here's what makes this fascinating. Both men were trying to solve the same fundamental problem: human suffering and injustice. Both believed the systems they inherited were deeply flawed. Both wanted to create a better world. And yet they arrived at conclusions so opposed that their followers would spend the next 2 centuries in bitter conflict, sometimes even war. Locke grew up in Somerset, England, during the most turbulent period in British history. His father fought for Parliament against the king. Young John absorbed the dangerous idea that monarchs were not appointed by God, that common people had the right to question authority. He studied medicine at Oxford, became a doctor, but his real passion was philosophy and politics. He was careful, methodical, always watching, always thinking. When his political allies fell from power, he fled to Holland, living in exile, writing in secret, knowing his words could get him killed. His most important works, including the 2 treatises of government, were published anonymously. Even years later, he never publicly admitted to writing them. This wasn't modesty, it was survival. The ideas in those pages were revolutionary enough to be considered treason. Marx's childhood was comfortable by comparison. His father was a lawyer in Trier, a small city in Prussia. The family was Jewish but had converted to Christianity to avoid persecution. Young Karl was brilliant, arrogant, impossible to ignore. He studied philosophy, got into fights, wrote poetry, fell in love, and gradually became radicalized by what he saw happening around him. The Industrial Revolution was transforming Europe. Factories were rising, old feudal structures were crumbling, and a new class of people, neither peasants nor nobles, were emerging, workers who owned nothing but their labor. Marx watched these workers, studied them, lived among them. He saw men who built everything, made everything, transported everything, yet lived in poverty, while factory owners accumulated unprecedented wealth. Unlike Locke, who worked within the system, befriending powerful nobles and advising governments, Marx positioned himself as its enemy. He was expelled from multiple countries, lived most of his adult life in poverty in London, supported by his friend Engels, writing furiously, organizing workers, trying to spark the revolution he believed was inevitable. What's striking is how different their personalities were. Locke was cautious, diplomatic, a man who understood power because he moved among the powerful. Marx was combative, unwilling to compromise, a man who understood oppression because he stood with the oppressed. And these personality differences in some ways mirror the philosophies they created. Locke's liberalism is careful, incremental, focused on protecting what people already have, their property, their freedoms, their rights. It assumes the system can be reformed from within. Marx's socialism is urgent, radical, insisting the entire system must be overthrown because it's rotten at its foundation. It assumes those in power will never voluntarily share it. But before we can understand why they disagreed, we need to understand what they agreed on. Both rejected the divine right of kings, both believed in human reason, both thought the goal of political philosophy was human flourishing. Both recognized that the way society is organized profoundly affects human happiness. Where they split, and this is crucial, is on a single question that might seem abstract but has massive practical consequences. What is a human being, fundamentally? Because how you answer that question determines everything else. It determines what rights people should have, what obligations they owe each other, how society should be structured, what freedom means, what justice looks like. For Locke, humans are individuals first. We exist before society, we have natural rights before any government, and we create political structures to protect those pre-existing rights. For Marx, humans are social creatures shaped entirely by the economic relationships around them. There's no such thing as the isolated individual with natural rights. We're all products of the historical moment we're born into, the class we belong to, the material conditions of our existence. This disagreement might sound philosophical, abstract, removed from real life. But think about what it means in practice. If Locke is right, then the goal is to protect individual liberty, limit government power, let people pursue their own happiness. If Marx is right, then focusing on individual liberty is naive because individuals aren't free in any meaningful sense when they're trapped in exploitative economic relationships. And here's where it gets really interesting. Both men can point to aspects of reality that seem to prove them right. Look around and you can see individuals making choices, taking risks, building businesses, creating art, living according to their own values. Locke seems vindicated. But look again, and you can see how your choices are constrained by whether you were born rich or poor, by the economic system you inhabit, by forces far beyond individual control. Marx seems vindicated. The question we're going to explore across this entire lecture is this: were they describing different aspects of the same reality, or were they fundamentally incompatible? Can you build a society that honors both individual freedom and collective welfare, or must you ultimately choose? But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand the depth of this conflict, we need to start where both Locke and Marx started, with the most basic question of all: strip away everything. Imagine a human being with no society, no government, no laws, no property, no history, just a person, alone, in what philosophers call the state of nature. What is that person like? What do they want? What are they capable of? What do they deserve? This thought experiment might seem pointless. After all, humans have never existed outside society. We're born into families, cultures, institutions. There's no such thing as a truly isolated human being. But how you imagine this hypothetical person reveals everything about your politics. Locke imagined the state of nature as a place of freedom and equality. Not a paradise, but not a nightmare either. People in this natural condition are rational creatures who can understand basic moral truths. They recognize that other people exist, that others have the same desires for life and happiness they do. They're capable of restraint, of making agreements, of keeping promises. Yes, there are dangers. Without government, there's no one to settle disputes or punish wrongdoers. But humans aren't savages. They're moral beings with natural rights that exist whether any government recognizes them or not. What are these natural rights? Locke identified three: life, liberty, and property. You own yourself. Your body, your labor, your thoughts are yours. No one has the right to harm you, enslave you, or take what's yours without consent. These aren't gifts from society or government. They're inherent to being human. Government doesn't create these rights. It exists to protect them. This is a powerful idea. It means that your dignity, your freedom, your claim to what you've created doesn't depend on any king or parliament or majority vote. It's yours by nature. And if government violates these natural rights, if it becomes tyrannical, you have the right to resist, even to overthrow it. This was revolutionary thinking in the 17th century. It still is. But notice what this assumes. It assumes humans are individuals first, capable of independent reason and moral judgment. It assumes we can own things separately from others. It assumes our interests might conflict, but we're capable of respecting each other's boundaries. It assumes equality means equal rights, not equal outcomes. Marx looked at this whole framework and saw something Locke couldn't see or refused to see: a justification for inequality dressed up as natural law. For Marx, there's no such thing as universal human nature separate from historical circumstances. The idea of the isolated individual making rational choices is a fiction, a projection backward of the particular conditions of capitalist society. Humans are social beings. We produce things together, we depend on each other for survival, our consciousness itself is shaped by our relationships with others. You can't understand what a human being is without understanding the society they're embedded in. And here's the crucial part. Society isn't neutral. It's organized around economic relationships, specifically around the question of who owns and controls the means of production. The means of production are simply everything needed to make things: land, tools, factories, resources. In every era of history, society has been divided between those who own the means of production and those who don't, who must sell their labor to survive. Masters and slaves, lords and serfs, capitalists and workers. These aren't minor differences, they're fundamental antagonisms. The person who owns the factory and the person who works in it have completely opposed interests. The owner wants to pay as little as possible and extract as much work as possible. The worker wants the opposite. There's no harmony here, no mutual benefit despite what liberal economics claims. There's conflict, exploitation, one class living off the labor of another. So when Locke talks about natural rights and individual freedom, Marx hears the voice of property owners trying to justify their position. Of course, the wealthy want to believe property is a natural right. Of course, they want to believe everyone starts equal and outcomes reflect individual merit. These beliefs protect their privilege. But look at the reality Marx saw. A child born in a factory town in 1840s, England has no property, no capital, no means of supporting themselves except by selling their labor power. They don't freely choose to work 14 hours a day in dangerous conditions for wages that barely keep them alive. They're forced to by economic necessity. Where's the freedom? Where's the equality? Where are these natural rights supposed to protect them? For Marx, human nature isn't fixed. It's historically variable, shaped by the mode of production. Under capitalism, humans are alienated from their labor, from the products they create, from each other, even from themselves. The worker doesn't see themselves reflected in what they produce. They're just a cog in a machine owned by someone else. But this isn't inevitable. Change the economic structure and you change human nature itself. Now you might already see why these visions clash so fundamentally. Locke believes there's a core human nature that exists prior to any social arrangement. Protect that nature, those natural rights, and humans will flourish. Marx believes human nature is entirely socially constructed, and under capitalism, it's deformed, twisted into something unnatural. But here's what makes this more than just an academic argument. Both perspectives contain uncomfortable truths. Locke is right that humans are capable of individual agency, of making choices, of bearing responsibility. Treating people purely as products of their circumstances strips them of dignity. But Marx is right that our choices are profoundly constrained by material conditions. Pretending everyone starts equal when some inherit fortunes and others inherit nothing is absurd. The question is whether these insights can coexist. Can you acknowledge both individual agency and structural constraint? Can you protect individual rights while also recognizing that those rights are meaningless if you lack the material means to exercise them? Locke would say yes, but carefully. Protect property rights, limit government, let people keep what they earn, and prosperity will spread. Some inequality is inevitable and not unjust if it comes from different choices and efforts. Marx would say this is naive. Protecting property rights when property is already unequally distributed just freezes existing injustice in place. The only solution is collective ownership, democratically controlled. And here we approach something crucial, something that will echo through every topic we discuss. Locke thinks freedom means freedom from interference. Leave people alone and they'll figure out how to live well. Marx thinks this is freedom for the powerful, not the powerless. Real freedom, he argues, means freedom from necessity, from exploitation, from being forced to sell yourself to survive. These aren't compatible definitions. And that's the problem, or maybe the richness of this debate. They're not just disagreeing about policies. They're disagreeing about what words mean. What is freedom? What is equality? What is justice? What is human nature itself? But there's one concept where their disagreement becomes most concrete, most visceral, most directly relevant to how we actually live: property. Because for Locke, property is sacred, the foundation of all other rights. For Marx, private property is theft, the source of all exploitation. You're standing in a forest. No one owns this land. It's just there like it's been for thousands of years. You find a fruit tree, pick some apples, eat them. Are those apples yours? Locke says yes, obviously. The moment you picked them, you mixed your labor with something from nature, and that act of labor created property rights. The apples were common resources, available to anyone. But you exerted effort, you picked them, and now they belong to you. No one else has the right to take them. This seems intuitive, but push it further. You don't just pick apples for one meal. You spend weeks clearing land, planting seeds, tending crops. Months later, you harvest food. That food is yours, right? You created it through your labor, but now you have more than you can eat. You store it, trade some for tools. Eventually, you hire someone to help with the harvest. You pay them a wage. But the surplus, the profit, that's yours because you own the land, you took the risk, you organized the whole operation. This is Locke's labor theory of property, and it's the philosophical foundation of capitalism. Property isn't arbitrary, it isn't theft, it's the natural consequence of mixing your labor with the world. And because it's natural, it exists before government and creates moral obligations. Government can't just take your property without consent. That would be tyranny, a violation of natural law. But Locke included an important caveat, one his later followers often ignored. You can claim property through labor, but only when there's enough and as good left for others. You can't monopolize resources everyone needs. Your property rights end where they harm others' ability to survive. In practice, Locke thought this limitation was satisfied by economic development. Yes, you enclosed common land, but agriculture produces more food than foraging, so everyone benefits. Yes, you accumulated wealth, but commerce increases general prosperity. Inequality is acceptable if the poorest person under private property is better off than they would be in common ownership. This is still the basic defense of capitalism. Sure, there's inequality, but even the poor in capitalist societies have more than peasants in pre-industrial economies. Overall, prosperity matters more than distribution. Marx spent much of his intellectual life demolishing this argument, showing how it hides the reality of exploitation behind the appearance of equal exchange. Start with that person you hired to help with the harvest. You pay them a wage. They agree to it. Seems fair, right? But ask a deeper question. Why do they agree? Because they don't own land. They don't have the resources to grow their own food. They must sell their labor or starve. So the agreement isn't between equals. It's between someone with property and someone with nothing but their body and time. Now look at what happens. The worker labors for, say, 8 hours. In the first 4 hours, they produce enough value to cover their wage, but they don't stop at 4 hours. They work 8 or 10 or 12. That extra value, that surplus, goes to you, the owner. You didn't create it, the worker did. But because you own the means of production, you claim the surplus as profit. This is exploitation, Marx argued, not in a moral sense of being mean or cruel. In a technical sense, appropriating value you didn't create because of your property position. And it's systematic. It's how capitalism works. Profit isn't reward for risk or innovation. It's unpaid labor. Here's where it gets really interesting. Locke claimed property comes from mixing labor with nature. But look at how property actually emerged historically, through conquest, slavery, colonialism, enclosure movements that drove peasants off common land. The current distribution of property wasn't established by everyone laboring and keeping what they created. It was established by violence and then justified after the fact with stories about natural rights and individual merit. Marx called this primitive accumulation. Before capitalism could function, before there could be a class of workers willing to sell their labor, they had to be separated from their means of subsistence. Common lands were enclosed, peasants were pushed off, tools and resources were monopolized. A mass of people with nothing but their labor power was created through force, and then capitalism presented this as the natural starting point. So when Locke talks about property rights, he's not describing a universal principle. He's defending a particular historical arrangement that benefits property owners. The language of natural rights makes it sound eternal and just, but strip that away and you see a system where most people work for others who own what they need to survive. But here's what Marx's critics, especially those following Locke's tradition, will point out. If labor creates value and the worker should receive all they create, why stop at wage labor? What about entrepreneurs who risk capital? What about inventors who create new technologies? What about the organizational effort of coordinating production? Don't these contribute value? The Marxist response is subtle. Yes, these activities create value, but under capitalism, they're compensated far beyond their actual contribution because of monopoly ownership. The owner receives profit not proportional to what they contribute, but proportional to what they own. And that ownership itself was established through historical processes that weren't based on labor. There's something else, something both fascinating and troubling. Both Locke and Marx believe labor is the source of value and property. They both think working, creating, building is what gives you a claim to things, but they draw opposite conclusions. For Locke, this means protect private property, because property represents stored labor. For Marx, this means abolish private ownership of the means of production, because private property allows some to claim the products of others' labor. Same principle, opposite conclusions, which suggests the principle itself might be incomplete, that something else is at stake. That something else is power. Who decides how surplus is distributed? Who controls what gets produced? Who has authority over the workplace? For Locke, these questions are answered by property rights. The owner decides because they own. For Marx, this is precisely the problem. Economic power shouldn't rest with owners. It should rest with workers collectively. And this brings us to perhaps the deepest question in political philosophy. Imagine you're about to be born, but you don't know into what circumstances. You don't know if you'll be rich or poor, talented or ordinary, healthy or sick. Behind this veil of ignorance, what kind of society would you choose? This thought experiment, refined by later philosophers but rooted in Locke's ideas, suggests something profound. Legitimate political authority requires consent. Not the consent of conquest, not the consent of tradition, not the consent of divine appointment. Actual agreement between free people. Locke's social contract theory starts with those individuals in the state of nature we discussed earlier. They have natural rights, but there's a problem. Without government, there's no impartial judge to settle disputes. If someone steals from you, there's no police force. If someone harms you, there's no court system. You're judge, jury, and enforcer in your own case. which means conflicts escalate, violence spreads, everyone lives in uncertainty. So rational people make an agreement. They consent to create government, surrendering some of their natural freedom in exchange for security and impartial justice. They empower representatives to make laws, judges to interpret them, police to enforce them. But, and this is crucial, the government's power comes from the people. It's delegated, conditional, revocable. If government violates the natural rights it was created to protect, the contract is broken and people have the right to dissolve it. This is why Locke was so dangerous to monarchs. He was saying explicitly that kings rule by consent, not divine right. Political authority flows upward from the people, not downward from God. Rebellion against tyranny isn't a sin, it's a right. The social contract sounds abstract, but think about what it implies practically. Laws are legitimate only if they could theoretically be agreed to by free people. Taxation requires consent through representation. Government can't arbitrarily seize property or restrict freedom. There are limits to political power, boundaries that even democratic majorities can't cross, because some rights are inalienable. This framework became the foundation for constitutional democracy, for limited government, for the idea that political power should be dispersed and checked. The American Declaration of Independence is pure Locke. Governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, and when government becomes destructive of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, people have the right to alter or abolish it. It's beautiful theory. It treats people as free agents capable of self-governance. It provides philosophical grounds for resisting tyranny. It suggests political arrangements should serve human flourishing, not divine plans or historical destiny. But Marx looked at this entire framework and saw something Locke either couldn't see or deliberately obscured. Social contract theory assumes everyone comes to the negotiating table as equals, when in reality, they don't. Think about the moment of that supposed agreement. Some people already own vast amounts of property. Others own nothing. Some have education, connections, resources. Others have only their labor power. Are they really negotiating as equals? When you're starving and someone offers you a job at subsistence wages, is that a free contract? When the alternative to accepting the terms is death, how meaningful is consent? Marx's fundamental insight was that political power reflects economic power. The state isn't a neutral arbiter standing above society, protecting everyone's rights equally. It's an instrument of class domination, a way for those who own the means of production to enforce their will on those who don't. Look at history, Marx said. Every legal system protects property rights. Every police force primarily defends the interests of the wealthy. Laws against theft are stringent, but laws against wage theft or dangerous working conditions are weak or unenforced. The social contract isn't an agreement between equals. It's a method by which the powerful legitimize their power, making domination appear consensual. This is a devastating critique because it exposes how liberal theory can rationalize injustice. By focusing on formal equality, on everyone having the same legal rights, it ignores substantive inequality, the fact that identical rights mean very different things depending on your economic position. The rich man and the poor man both have the right to sleep under bridges, as the saying goes, but only one of them needs to. For Marx, the motor of history isn't social contracts or philosophical agreements. It's class struggle. In every era, society is divided into classes with antagonistic interests. The conflict between these classes drives historical change. Slave revolts transform ancient societies. Peasant rebellions weaken feudalism. Worker movements challenge capitalism. This struggle is material, rooted in economic relationships, not in ideas or agreements. And here's what makes this perspective so compelling. It explains things social contract theory can't. Why do laws systematically favor the wealthy? Why does government intervention to help corporations happen smoothly, while intervention to help workers faces endless resistance? Why are property rights sacred, but labor rights constantly under attack? Social contract theory has to treat these as deviations, failures to live up to principles. Marx says they're features, not bugs. The system is working exactly as designed to benefit owners at the expense of workers. But there's a problem with Marx's analysis, one that defenders of liberal democracy are quick to point out. If government is just an instrument of class domination, how do you explain reforms that benefit workers? How do you explain labor laws, minimum wages, safety regulations, welfare programs? These exist in capitalist democracies. They weren't granted voluntarily by benevolent capitalists. They were won through struggle, yes, but won within the framework of democratic politics. The Marxist response is that these are concessions, granted to prevent revolution, to stabilize capitalism, to preserve the system while making it slightly more tolerable. They don't fundamentally change who owns and controls the means of production. The worker gets better conditions but remains a worker, still selling their labor, still generating profit for someone else. Yet this leads to an interesting question. If the system can reform itself, can incorporate demands from below, can improve conditions while maintaining its basic structure, isn't that preferable to violent revolution? Isn't gradual progress better than gambling on utopia? Marx would say you're missing the point. The improvements are real but limited. They don't address the fundamental relationship of exploitation. And more importantly, they're always precarious, always under threat. What's granted can be taken away. Without changing ownership of the means of production, workers are always vulnerable, always dependent on the goodwill or fear of owners. Locke would counter that this is exactly why you need constitutional protections, rule of law, separation of powers. Not perfect equality, which is impossible and probably undesirable, but legal equality, protection against arbitrary power, mechanisms for peaceful change. Social contract theory doesn't promise utopia. It promises something more modest, a framework where people can cooperate despite disagreement, pursue happiness as they understand it, and change the rules without bloodshed. And here we hit something really important, something that determines whether you find Locke or Marx more persuasive. Do you think the primary conflict in society is between those who want freedom and those who want power, or between those who own and those who work? Because how you answer determines everything else. If the main conflict is about freedom versus tyranny, then Locke's framework makes sense. Limit government, protect rights, trust in individual initiative, and society will self-organize toward prosperity. If the main conflict is between classes with opposed economic interests, then Marx's framework makes sense. Class struggle is fundamental and won't be resolved by legal tinkering. It requires transforming the economic base. The fascinating thing is both men can point to historical evidence. Locke's followers can point to the rise of liberal democracies, the spread of prosperity, the fact that countries with strong property rights and limited government tend to be wealthier and freer. Marx's followers can point to persistent inequality, the way wealth concentrates, the recurring crises of capitalism, the fact that worker gains required struggle, not just persuasion. Perhaps the deepest question is this: can you have genuine political equality while maintaining economic inequality? Locke thinks yes. One person, one vote, equal rights before the law, protection of liberty. These are compatible with some people being richer than others, as long as the wealth was earned fairly. Marx thinks no. Economic power inevitably translates into political power. The wealthy will use their resources to shape laws, influence elections, control media. Legal equality is a fiction when substantive inequality is vast. And this isn't just theoretical. Look at contemporary democracies. Do they operate on social contract principles, with government reflecting the will of equal citizens? Or do they operate on class struggle principles, with economic elites capturing political institutions? You can find evidence for both interpretations. What's undeniable is that both Locke and Marx identified something real. Locke identified the human desire for liberty, for self-governance, for protection against arbitrary power. Marx identified the reality of exploitation, the way economic structures shape political possibilities, the persistence of class conflict. The question is whether these insights can be reconciled or whether you must choose. But before we can answer that, we need to understand what each man meant by a word both used constantly but defined completely differently: freedom. Tell someone they're not free and watch what happens. They'll resist, get defensive, maybe angry. Freedom is sacred, the highest political value in modern societies. We fight wars for it, build monuments to it, invoke it to justify almost any political position. But what does it actually mean? For Locke and the liberal tradition he founded, freedom is simple, the absence of interference. You're free to the extent that others, especially government, leave you alone to pursue your own goals. Freedom is negative space, the area where no one can legitimately control you. This definition has tremendous appeal. It respects individual agency. It acknowledges that people have different values, different visions of the good life, and shouldn't be forced to conform to a single plan. It creates space for experimentation, diversity, individual flourishing. You want to start a business? You're free to try. Want to be an artist? You're free to pursue it. Want to live in the mountains away from everyone? You're free to do that too. The role of government in this framework is minimal. Protect people from force and fraud, enforce contracts, defend the country, maybe provide some basic public goods. Beyond that, leave people alone. Don't tell them what to do, what to value, how to live. Trust that free individuals pursuing their own interests will create spontaneous order, prosperity, progress. This vision of freedom resonates deeply with something in human psychology. We value autonomy. We resist being controlled. We want to make our own choices, even if they're mistakes. The liberal conception of freedom honors this, treating adults as capable of directing their own lives. But there's a question lurking here, one Marx seized on with devastating effect. What good is freedom from interference if you lack the means to do anything with it? Imagine two people. One inherits a fortune. They have property, investments, resources. They can choose their occupation, pursue their interests, live where they want, support causes they believe in. Another person is born into poverty. They must work immediately to survive. Their job options are limited to what employers will offer. They can't afford education, can't take risks, can't relocate, can't wait for better opportunities. They're legally free. No one is forcing them to work. They could quit anytime. But practically, economically, they have almost no choices at all. Both have negative liberty, freedom from interference, but only one has meaningful freedom, the actual ability to shape their life according to their values. For Marx, focusing on legal freedom while ignoring material constraints is either naive or deliberately misleading. It's a way of pretending everyone has equal opportunity when the game is rigged from birth. Marx didn't just want freedom from interference. He wanted freedom from necessity, from the compulsion to sell your labor or starve. Real freedom requires material security, access to resources, control over your work. A worker who must accept whatever terms an employer offers isn't free in any meaningful sense. They're coerced by economic necessity. This leads to a completely different vision of what freedom requires. Not minimal government that leaves people alone, but active intervention to ensure everyone has the material basis for genuine choice. Not protecting property rights that reflect existing inequality, but socializing the means of production so everyone has equal access. Not individual liberty, but collective emancipation. And here's where things get philosophically interesting. These aren't just different priorities, they're incompatible conceptions of what freedom is. If freedom means absence of interference, then redistributing wealth violates freedom. You're taking from some to give to others, forcing people to act against their will. But if freedom means having real options, then allowing vast inequality violates freedom. You're letting some people dominate others through economic power. Locke would argue that Marx's positive conception of freedom, freedom to do things rather than freedom from interference, inevitably requires tyranny. Because ensuring everyone has material security means massive government intervention, planning the economy, controlling production, redistributing resources. That requires coercion, taking from people who earned things and giving to those who didn't. It means a powerful state making decisions about how resources are allocated. And powerful states, history shows, become oppressive. Better to have negative liberty, even if it results in inequality, than to sacrifice liberty in pursuit of equality and end up with neither. The poor person under capitalism may struggle, but they're legally free. The worker under socialism may have material security, but they live under a state that controls every aspect of economic life. Which would you prefer? Marx would respond that this is a false choice. The opposition between freedom and equality only exists under capitalism, where a few people owning everything limits everyone else's freedom. In a socialist society where means of production are collectively owned, there's no tension. Everyone has both material security and genuine choice. No one is coerced by economic necessity. No one is dominated by property owners. But here's the empirical problem Marx faced. Every attempt to implement his vision has required enormous state power, restrictions on individual choice, suppression of dissent. The Soviet Union, Maoist China, Cuba, North Korea, these weren't places of expanded freedom. They were authoritarian regimes where individual liberty was crushed in the name of collective welfare. Defenders of Marx argue these weren't real socialism, that Marxist principles were betrayed by authoritarian leaders. The idea was workers' democracy, not party dictatorship, common ownership, not state bureaucracy. But critics point out that this has happened every single time. Maybe the problem isn't implementation. Maybe it's inherent to trying to abolish private property and plan an entire economy centrally. There's another dimension to this freedom debate, one both men understood but emphasized differently. Freedom as self-governance, the ability of a community to determine its own rules. For Locke, self-governance meant representative democracy, constitutional limits, rule of law. People consent to government, elect representatives, can change leaders through peaceful means. This is collective freedom, not being ruled by foreign powers or despots, but ruling yourselves through chosen institutions. Marx thought this was incomplete. Political democracy without economic democracy is a sham. If workers don't control their workplaces, don't have a say in what's produced and how, then they're not self-governing in the most important domain of their lives. You spend 8, 10, 12 hours a day under someone else's authority, following orders, serving their goals. How is that freedom? This is why Marx advocated for workers' councils, for direct participation in economic decision-making, for abolishing the distinction between owners who decide and workers who obey. Real self-governance means democratic control over all institutions that affect your life, including economic ones. Locke would be skeptical. Most people don't want to spend their time in endless meetings making collective decisions about production. They want to do their job, earn their wage, go home, and live their private lives. Representative democracy in politics is enough. Economic life can be organized through voluntary contracts between employers and employees. And here we see a fundamental difference in how they viewed human nature and human desires. Marx believed humans want meaningful work, want to participate in shaping their society, want to overcome alienation. These desires are suppressed under capitalism but would flourish under socialism. Locke believed humans primarily want security, property, and private happiness. They're willing to delegate political authority and accept hierarchy in exchange for stability and prosperity. Who's right? Both can point to evidence. Some people do crave meaningful participation, do want to be involved in collective decision-making, do feel alienated by hierarchical work. Others just want a paycheck, don't care about workplace democracy, and value free time over participation. Maybe human desires vary, or maybe they're shaped by circumstances, fulfilling each theory's predictions. But here's what makes this debate perpetually relevant. The tension between negative and positive liberty, between freedom as non-interference and freedom as capability, hasn't been resolved. Modern social democracies try to combine both, protect individual rights and property, while also ensuring material security through welfare programs. But this is an unstable compromise, constantly pulled in both directions. When economic crisis hits, should government intervene to protect jobs and security, or respect property rights and let markets adjust? When inequality grows, should we redistribute through taxation, or is that violating people's freedom to keep what they earned? When corporations dominate markets, should we break them up to preserve competition, or is that government overreach? Every political debate comes back to this fundamental question. What does freedom require? And underneath it all is the question neither Locke nor Marx could definitively answer. Can you have a society that's both free and equal, or must you ultimately choose which value matters more? It's midnight. Someone breaks into your house. Who do you call? The answer seems obvious. The police, an agent of government with the authority to use force on your behalf. Even the most committed libertarian in that moment wants government intervention. This simple fact reveals something important. Everyone agrees government has some legitimate role. The question is how much. For Locke, government should be a night watchman. It patrols the perimeter, keeps order, protects against threats, but doesn't interfere with what happens inside people's homes. Its core functions are narrowly defined: protect life, liberty, and property, prevent force and fraud, enforce contracts, defend against foreign invasion, maybe build roads and infrastructure everyone needs. That's it. Why so limited? Because government is dangerous. It's the only institution with legal authority to use force. It can imprison you, seize your property, even kill you. This power is necessary, but it's also the greatest threat to freedom. History is full of tyrannical governments doing terrible things. The solution isn't to make government powerful and hope leaders stay benevolent. It's to limit government power strictly to essential functions. Locke's night watchman state has elegant simplicity. It protects everyone's rights equally without picking winners and losers. It doesn't redistribute wealth, doesn't regulate how you use your property, doesn't tell you what you can buy or sell, doesn't dictate how you should live. It just maintains order and lets civil society, markets, voluntary associations handle everything else. This vision assumes something crucial, that society can organize itself spontaneously without central direction. People pursuing their own interests will create businesses, provide services, develop culture, solve problems. You don't need government planning. You need government to stay out of the way. The 20th century economist Friedrich Hayek, following Locke's tradition, argued that markets are information processing systems far more sophisticated than any central planner could be. Prices signal scarcity and demand. Entrepreneurs respond to opportunities. Competition drives efficiency. This spontaneous order produces better outcomes than deliberate design. Government intervention disrupts these signals, creates inefficiencies, and ultimately makes everyone worse off. This isn't just theory. Point to the most prosperous societies in history. They tend to be ones with limited government, strong property rights, free markets, rule of law. Point to the poorest, most dysfunctional societies. They tend to be ones with massive government intervention, weak property rights, controlled economies. Correlation isn't causation, but the pattern is striking. Marx looked at the same history and saw something entirely different. Government as the executive committee of the ruling class. Every state, Marx argued, is an instrument of class power. In slave societies, government enforced slavery. In feudal societies, it protected lords' privileges. In capitalist societies, it defends property rights that benefit owners over workers. The state isn't neutral. It's not standing above society arbitrating fairly. It's embedded in economic relationships, serving whoever controls the means of production. The functions Locke assigned to government, protecting life, liberty, and property, sound neutral. But look closer. Which property is government protecting? The factory owner's control over the workplace, not the worker's right to fair compensation. The landlord's ability to evict tenants, not tenants' right to housing. The corporation's intellectual property, not workers' claim to the products of their labor. Police don't protect everyone equally. They protect property and order, which means protecting the interests of those who benefit from the current distribution of both. Laws against theft are enforced aggressively. Laws against wage theft or unsafe working conditions are barely enforced at all. This isn't corruption or failure. It's the system working as designed. For Marx, the solution isn't to limit government. That just leaves economic power unchecked. The solution is to transform government's class character, making it serve workers instead of owners, and ultimately to create a society without classes at all, where government in the traditional sense withers away because there's no longer one group dominating another. But here's where Marx's theory meets practical complications. How do you use government to abolish class divisions without creating a new ruling class? The government bureaucrats themselves. How do you plan an economy without concentrating enormous power in the state? Marx envisioned a transition phase, the dictatorship of the proletariat. Workers would seize state power, use it to expropriate owners, reorganize production collectively, and gradually, as class divisions disappeared, the state would wither away. People would govern themselves directly through workers' councils and communes without needing a separate apparatus of force standing over them. This vision is compelling in theory, but every attempt to implement it has gone wrong in similar ways. The Revolutionary Vanguard Party takes power, claims to represent workers, but becomes a new ruling class. The state doesn't wither away, it grows stronger, more intrusive, more authoritarian. Instead of government serving workers, workers serve the state. Why does this keep happening? Defenders of liberal democracy argue it's inevitable. Concentrating economic and political power in the same hands creates totalitarianism. Separating them, even imperfectly, creates space for freedom. Yes, wealthy people have disproportionate political influence under capitalism, but they don't control everything. There's still room for opposition, for organization, for change. Under state socialism, opposing the government means opposing the entity that controls your job, your housing, your food supply. Dissent becomes impossible. Marxists counter that these failures stemmed from specific historical circumstances, backward economies, civil wars, foreign intervention, authoritarian traditions. Marx expected revolution in advanced industrial democracies like Britain or Germany, not agrarian societies like Russia or China. If socialism emerged in wealthy democratic societies, it could maintain democratic institutions while socializing the economy. Maybe. But we don't have evidence for this. Every socialist revolution happened in poor, often authoritarian contexts, and everyone created authoritarian outcomes. At what point does the pattern suggest the problem is theoretical, not just circumstantial? There's another angle to government's role that both men addressed, but from different perspectives. What obligations does government have beyond protecting rights or serving class interests? Locke acknowledged that government might need to act when private charity isn't enough. If people are starving, some intervention might be justified. But this should be minimal, temporary, local. The default is individual responsibility and voluntary association. Government safety nets create dependency, discourage work, and violate property rights by taxing some to support others. Marx would say this reveals liberalism's cruelty. If capitalism produces unemployment, poverty, and misery, saying government shouldn't intervene is saying people should just suffer. The liberal state protects property while people starve and calls this freedom. Modern democracies have largely rejected Locke's minimalism. We have public education, healthcare systems, pension programs, unemployment insurance, regulations on workplace safety, environmental protection, consumer protections. These didn't emerge because politicians suddenly became generous. They emerged because workers organized, demanded change, and forced government to expand its role. Is this expansion of government compatible with liberal principles? Some liberals say yes, arguing that protecting meaningful freedom requires ensuring basic capabilities. You can't exercise liberty if you're illiterate, sick, or starving. Others say no, arguing that every expansion of government power diminishes individual freedom and moves towards socialism. The practical question every society faces is where to draw the line. Even people who want limited government disagree about what counts as essential. National defense, obviously. Police and courts, certainly. Roads and infrastructure, probably. Public education, maybe. Healthcare, controversial. Income support, very controversial. Industrial policy, depends who you ask. And here's what makes this endlessly complicated. Government intervention creates both opportunities and problems. Regulation can protect consumers or create barriers benefiting established firms. Welfare can provide security or create dependency. Public services can democratize access or entrench bureaucracy. The effects depend on design, implementation, context. Locke's vision of minimal government has the virtue of limiting these problems by limiting government itself. If government does less, there's less that can go wrong, less corruption, less waste, less opportunity for abuse. Marx's vision of a workers' state has the virtue of potentially addressing root causes of poverty and exploitation rather than just managing symptoms. But both visions, taken to extremes, create disasters. Failed states that can't maintain order, or totalitarian states that crush freedom. The messy reality most democracies inhabit is somewhere in between, neither night watchman nor central planner. Government does more than Locke wanted, but less than Marx demanded. It protects property, but also regulates it. It allows markets, but also intervenes when they fail. It respects individual rights, but also pursues collective goals. This pragmatic middle ground satisfies almost no one theoretically, but seems to work reasonably well practically, which raises an important question. Maybe the debate isn't really about government's proper role in abstract. Maybe it's about who benefits from different levels of intervention. Close your eyes and imagine a perfectly functioning economy. What does it look like? How are decisions made about what to produce, how to produce it, who gets what? Your answer reveals your deepest assumptions about human nature, social organization, and justice. For Locke and the liberal tradition, the answer is markets. Millions of people making decisions based on their own knowledge and preferences, coordinating through the price system without anyone in charge. You want shoes. Multiple producers compete for your business. They innovate to improve quality, reduce costs, differentiate their products. You choose based on what meets your needs and budget. The producer who serves you best makes profit, expands, serves more people. Less successful producers adjust or exit. No central authority decides who makes shoes or how many. The market figures it out. This is spontaneous order, and it's genuinely remarkable when you think about it. No one planned that your grocery store would have bananas this morning. Farmers in Ecuador made decisions about planting, exporters made decisions about shipping, distributors made decisions about routes, store managers made decisions about ordering, all coordinated by prices and profit signals without anyone directing the whole process. The efficiency of markets comes from several features. First, dispersed knowledge. The farmer knows local growing conditions. The consumer knows their preferences. No central planner can aggregate all this information. Markets use it without collecting it, through prices that signal scarcity and demand. Second, incentives. Profit and loss focus attention on serving others' needs, help people and you prosper, waste resources and you fail. Third, dynamism. Entrepreneurs constantly seek new opportunities, respond to changes, innovate. The system evolves without requiring anyone to predict the future. This economic system aligns naturally with Locke's political philosophy. Property rights create incentives to use resources productively. Competition limits power by giving consumers alternatives. Voluntary exchange ensures mutual benefit. Everyone pursues their own interest, and somehow the whole system produces prosperity. Adam Smith captured this idea with his famous metaphor of the invisible hand. Individuals pursuing private gain unintentionally promote public good. The butcher doesn't provide meat because he cares about you. He does it for profit. But the result is you get meat. Self-interest, channeled through markets, serves social welfare. The liberal economic vision promises something powerful. Prosperity without coercion, coordination without hierarchy, progress without planning. Just protect property, enforce contracts, maintain competition, and watch wealth multiply. And empirically, something like this seems to work. Countries that embraced market economics, Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, went from poverty to prosperity in decades. Technologies improving billions of lives, smartphones, medicines, transportation, came from market competition, not government planning. The massive reduction in global poverty over the past 50 years happened mostly in countries adopting market reforms. But Marx looked at capitalism and saw not spontaneous order but systematic exploitation dressed up as voluntary exchange. Start with a basic question. Where does profit come from? If everyone gets paid the value they contribute, if every exchange is mutually beneficial, how does the capitalist end up with surplus? The liberal answer is that capitalists contribute too. They provide capital, take risks, organize production, coordinate activity. Profit is their reward. Marx's answer is more radical. Profit comes from exploiting labor. The worker produces more value than they're paid. That surplus value goes to the capitalist not because the capitalist contributed it, but because the capitalist owns the means of production and can therefore claim the output. Think about a factory. A worker operates a machine for 8 hours, produces goods worth, say, $100. They're paid $20. The raw materials cost $20. The machine depreciation is $10. The capitalist pockets $50 as profit. Where did that $50 come from? The worker created the full value of $100. They're paid a fraction. The difference is extracted as profit because of ownership relations, not because the capitalist added $50 of value. Now the capitalist might object. I bought the machine, rented the factory, took the risk. Don't I deserve return on investment? Marx's response: where did you get the money to buy the machine? From previous exploitation of labor. And where did the first capitalists get their capital? From primitive accumulation, violent dispossession, colonialism, not from their own labor. The entire system rests on a fiction that capital and labor meet as equals in the market, make free contracts, engage in mutually beneficial exchange. But they're not equals. The capitalist owns means of production. The worker owns nothing but their labor power. The worker must sell or starve. This isn't free exchange. It's coercion by economic necessity. For Marx, markets don't coordinate production efficiently toward human needs. They coordinate production toward profit. If feeding hungry people isn't profitable, food won't be produced for them, even if resources are available. If treating diseases isn't profitable, medicines won't be developed, even if suffering could be prevented. The system responds to money, not need. And markets don't just misallocate resources. They create crisis. Capitalism has inherent contradictions. Competition drives capitalists to increase productivity, replace workers with machines, lower wages. But workers are also consumers. As their purchasing power falls, demand drops, goods can't be sold, businesses fail, unemployment rises. The system lurches from boom to bust, destroying wealth, devastating lives, all because production is organized for private profit rather than social need. Marx's alternative is a planned economy. Instead of anarchic market competition, conscious coordination. Instead of production for profit, production for use. Instead of private ownership, collective control. Society would democratically decide what to produce, allocate resources rationally, distribute goods fairly. Imagine it working. Communities assess their needs: food, housing, healthcare, education, infrastructure. They decide democratic what resources to allocate where. Production is organized cooperatively. Distribution is based on contribution or need, depending on abundance. No one profits from others' labor. No one starves while food is destroyed to maintain prices. No economic crises because production is planned to match social needs. This vision is compelling. It promises to eliminate exploitation, end crisis, subordinate economic activity to human welfare. It treats the economy as something we collectively control, not a force of nature we must submit to. But here's where theory meets reality, and reality has been brutal to central planning. Every attempt to run a complex economy without markets has failed. The Soviet Union tried for 70 years. It achieved rapid industrialization initially, but couldn't maintain innovation, efficiency, or adequate living standards. Planners couldn't get the information they needed. Incentives were wrong, bureaucracy became stifling, the system collapsed. China under Mao tried. Tens of millions died in famines caused by disastrous planning decisions. Only after introducing market reforms did China achieve rapid growth and poverty reduction. Cuba, North Korea, Venezuela, every economy that abolished markets and centralized planning has performed poorly compared to market economies. This isn't arguable. The empirical record is overwhelming. Why? Defenders of markets say it's inevitable. Without prices based on supply and demand, you can't know how to allocate resources efficiently. Without profit and loss, you can't know which activities create value and which destroy it. Without competition, you can't generate innovation. Without property rights, you can't create incentives for care and productivity. The knowledge problem is particularly devastating. A central planner needs to know everyone's preferences, all available resources, all possible production techniques, and continuously update this information as conditions change. Impossible. Markets solve this problem by using prices to signal information without anyone needing to collect it all. Marxists have responses. They argue that planning failed because it was attempted in poor countries under siege without democratic control. Modern computing could solve information problems. Democratic participation could replace market incentives. Abundance could eliminate scarcity driving market behavior. Maybe. But we don't have evidence that democratic planning works better. And the idea that technology solves the knowledge problem misunderstands it. The problem isn't computational power. It's that the relevant knowledge is dispersed, tacit, constantly changing. No algorithm can capture what individual farmers know about their land, what consumers know about their preferences, what entrepreneurs know about emerging opportunities. There's another issue Marx underestimated, the motivational problem. In markets, working harder, innovating, serving customers better directly benefits you through profit. In planned economies, what's your incentive? The Soviet Union tried moral incentives, appeals to collective good, awards for achievement. It wasn't enough. People respond to personal stakes. But defenders of markets shouldn't be too triumphant, because markets have problems too, problems Locke's theory doesn't adequately address. Markets require competition to function well, but competition tends to eliminate itself. Successful firms grow, buy competitors, establish monopolies. Without regulation, you get concentrated power, market manipulation, extraction rather than service. Markets create externalities, costs imposed on others not reflected in prices. Pollution, climate change, resource depletion, these are market failures. Private profit, social cost. Markets don't guarantee everyone can participate. If you're born without resources, have nothing to sell but labor in a market flooded with workers, you might starve despite the system's overall prosperity. The market is efficient, not just. And markets can be destabilizing. Financial crises, unemployment, boom-bust cycles, these aren't aberrations. They're features of market economies. Creative destruction sounds good in theory, but if you're the one destroyed, it's devastating. So we're left with a dilemma. Markets work better than planning for coordinating production, generating innovation, allocating resources. But they create inequality, instability, externalities, and don't guarantee that everyone's needs are met. Central planning could theoretically address these problems but has proven practically dysfunctional. Modern economies try to split the difference, mostly markets but with regulation, redistribution, public provision of certain goods, social safety nets. This isn't theoretically pure by either Locke or Marx's standards, but it's what we've got. The question is whether this hybrid is stable or whether tensions between its market and planning elements will eventually pull it apart. Picture two children born on the same day in the same city. One is born into a wealthy family with educated parents, connections, resources, and opportunities. The other is born into poverty with parents working multiple jobs, no savings, no connections, and constant stress. 20 years later, one has a college degree, a trust fund, and professional prospects. The other is working minimum wage, struggling with debt, facing limited options. Are these two people equal? Locke would say yes, in the most important sense. They have equal natural rights. The law treats them the same. Neither can legitimately harm or dominate the other. Their circumstances differ, but their fundamental moral status is identical. Equality means equal rights, not equal outcomes. This conception of equality has tremendous appeal. It treats every person as having inherent dignity regardless of their talents, wealth, or social position. A homeless person and a billionaire are moral equals. Neither's life is worth more than the other's. Neither should have legal privileges the other lacks. This is the foundation of modern human rights. Every person counts equally. And there's wisdom in not expecting equal outcomes. People have different abilities, make different choices, value different things. Some work harder, take more risks, develop more valuable skills. Some prioritize wealth, others prioritize leisure or creativity or relationships. Why should everyone end up with the same amount of stuff when they contribute differently and want different things? Enforcing equal outcomes would require massive coercion. You'd have to take from the successful to give to the unsuccessful, from the productive to the unproductive, from those who sacrificed to those who didn't. You'd punish achievement and reward failure. You'd need an enormous state apparatus to monitor everyone and redistribute constantly. The cure would be worse than the disease. Better to ensure equal opportunity, Locke's followers argue. Remove legal barriers. Don't discriminate based on birth or background. Let everyone compete fairly and accept that different talents and efforts produce different results. This respects individual agency. This creates incentives for excellence. But think about those two children again. Do they really have equal opportunity? One has tutors, enrichment activities, SAT prep, family connections, financial cushion to take unpaid internships. The other has none of these. They're both legally free to attend elite universities, but only one has a realistic chance. Equal opportunity in theory, but not in practice. Marx would say this exposes the hollowness of liberal equality. Yes, everyone has equal rights in the abstract, but abstract equality is worthless when material inequality is vast. The law in its majestic equality forbids both rich and poor from sleeping under bridges, as Anatole France sarcastically noted. Formal equality disguises substantive domination. Real equality requires material equality, or at least vastly reduced material inequality, because money is power. It determines your health outcomes, educational opportunities, legal representation, political influence, social connections, even how long you live. Pretending these differences don't matter because everyone has the same legal rights is absurd. For Marx, the liberal obsession with equal rights serves to legitimize inequality. By focusing on the legal sphere where people are formally equal, it directs attention away from the economic sphere where they're massively unequal. Workers and owners have equal legal status, but radically unequal economic positions. This inequality shapes everything about their lives but gets treated as natural or deserved. The deeper problem is that capitalism inevitably produces inequality. It's not a bug, it's a feature. Capital accumulates. Successful businesses reinvest profits, grow larger, dominate markets. Wealthy families pass advantages to children through inheritance, education, connections. Meanwhile, workers can only sell their labor, can't accumulate, remain dependent. Over time, wealth concentrates, inequality grows, and the gap between owners and workers widens. You can see this empirically. Look at wealth distribution in capitalist societies. The richest 1% own enormous shares of total wealth. The richest 0.1% own obscene amounts. Meanwhile, huge portions of the population have negative net worth, owing more than they own. This isn't because the wealthy are millions of times more talented or hardworking. It's because capital generates returns, and those returns compound. Marx argued that this inequality isn't just unfair, it's exploitative. The wealth of the rich comes from the unpaid labor of workers. Every dollar of profit represents value created by workers but claimed by owners. The system produces inequality through exploitation, then justifies it with talk of equal rights and fair competition. The solution for Marx is obvious. Abolish private ownership of the means of production. When workplaces are collectively owned, the surplus they generate is shared among workers, not extracted by capitalists. When land and resources are common property, no one can monopolize them. When inheritance of productive assets is eliminated, each generation starts more equally. This wouldn't mean everyone has identical incomes. Marx distinguished between equality of outcome and distribution according to contribution. In the initial phase of socialism, people would be compensated based on how much they worked. Those who contributed more would receive more, but the vast inequality between owners and workers would disappear because there would be no owners, only workers. Eventually, in full communism, Marx envisioned moving beyond even this. With productive forces sufficiently developed, abundance would replace scarcity. The principle would become from each according to ability to each according to need. People would contribute what they could and take what they needed without strict accounting. Inequality would become irrelevant because there would be enough for everyone. This vision is beautiful in its way. A society where no one starves while others feast, where everyone contributes meaningfully and has their needs met, where material concerns don't dominate life. No exploitation, no deprivation, no class division, just human beings cooperating to provide for collective welfare. But here's where Marx's vision crashes into uncomfortable realities. First, historical attempts to implement equality through collective ownership created new inequalities. Party members in communist states had privileges ordinary citizens lacked. State bureaucrats became a new ruling class. Formal equality of ownership masked practical hierarchies of power. Second, eliminating material incentives reduced productivity. If working harder doesn't improve your situation, and slacking off doesn't worsen it, why work hard? The Soviet Union constantly struggled with this. Workers had guaranteed employment but little incentive to excel. We pretend to work and they pretend to pay us, went the bitter joke. Third, people don't just want equality. They also want meritocracy, reward for achievement, recognition of excellence. Pure equality feels unfair to those who contribute more. This isn't just capitalist ideology, it's deep human psychology. We resent free riders. We value justice, which includes proportionality between contribution and reward. Defenders of capitalism argue that inequality, within limits, is not only inevitable but desirable. It creates incentives for innovation, entrepreneurship, excellence. It allows for diversity of outcomes reflecting diversity of choices. It respects individual differences in talent and effort. The question isn't whether there should be inequality, but how much and what kind. Some inequality might be justified if it reflects genuine differences in contribution. The brilliant innovator who creates products millions of people value arguably deserves more than someone who contributes less. The person who works 80 hours a week arguably deserves more than someone who works 40. The problem is when inequality becomes so extreme that it undermines the equal dignity and opportunity that even liberals claim to value. And here's where things get complicated, because massive inequality does undermine equal opportunity, creating precisely the problem Locke's theory claims to avoid. When the wealthy can buy political influence, better education, better healthcare, better legal representation, when they can pass these advantages to their children indefinitely, you no longer have equal opportunity. You have inherited privilege and disadvantage, class stratification, oligarchy. So even if you accept liberal premises, even if you prioritize liberty over equality, you face a problem. Extreme inequality threatens liberty itself. The very poor aren't free in any meaningful sense. They're trapped by circumstance, lacking options, vulnerable to exploitation. And the very rich have disproportionate power, can shape laws and norms to protect their position, can dominate those with less. This suggests that some level of material equality might be necessary for meaningful liberty, that you can't just ignore distribution and focus on rights. But how much equality? And achieved how? Redistribution through taxation, regulation of markets, public provision of basic goods, worker ownership. These questions don't have obvious answers. What's clear is that both pure equality and pure meritocracy are impossible ideals. Pure equality would require suppressing human differences and eliminating incentives. Pure meritocracy would require eliminating all inherited advantage and environmental influence, which is impossible. Every real society is somewhere in between, trying to balance competing values. Modern social democracies try to square this circle. They maintain market economies with property rights and inequality, but redistribute enough through taxes and transfers to provide basic security and opportunity for all. They accept some inequality as inevitable and even beneficial, but prevent it from becoming so extreme that it undermines democracy or dignity. This compromise satisfies neither Lockeans, who see redistribution as theft, nor Marxists, who see it as inadequate band-aid on a fundamentally unjust system. But it's proven more stable and prosperous than either pure capitalism or pure socialism. The question is whether this balance can hold, or whether the internal tensions will eventually pull it apart. Capitalist dynamics tend toward concentration. Democratic pressures tend toward redistribution. Can these forces remain in equilibrium, or will one eventually triumph? There's another dimension to equality that both Locke and Marx addressed, but from different angles. Equality of power, of status, of respect. For Locke, people are equal in the sense that no one has natural authority over another. Kings don't have divine right to rule. Masters don't have natural right to enslave. Every person is self-owned, entitled to respect, capable of self-governance. This is revolutionary, genuinely radical for its time. It undermines every traditional hierarchy, monarchy, aristocracy, slavery, patriarchy. But Locke thought this equal moral status was compatible with unequal economic positions. You could have masters and servants, employers and employees, wealthy and poor, as long as these relationships were voluntary and based on contract, not coercion. Economic hierarchy doesn't violate equal dignity as long as it's chosen. Marx rejected this completely. Economic hierarchy isn't separate from political hierarchy. It is political hierarchy. The boss has power over the worker, power to fire, to direct, to discipline, to surveil. The landlord has power over the tenant. The creditor has power over the debtor. These are relationships of domination just as much as master and slave, lord and serf. Calling them voluntary doesn't change the power dynamic. And these economic hierarchies undermine political equality. Wealthy people have more influence over elections, more access to politicians, more ability to shape public opinion through media ownership. They form a de facto ruling class even in nominally democratic societies. Universal suffrage creates formal political equality, but economic inequality creates substantive political inequality. For Marx, you can't have genuine equality, even equality of status and respect, in a class-divided society. As long as some people own and others work for them, as long as some people have vastly more resources than others, there will be hierarchy, domination, inequality of power. Legal equality is insufficient. This critique is powerful because it points to real phenomena. The wealthy do have disproportionate influence. Economic position does affect how you're treated, what opportunities you have, even how you see yourself. Class exists, even in societies that claim to have transcended it. But the Marxist alternative, abolishing class by abolishing private ownership, has its own problems with equality, because someone still has to make decisions about resource allocation, production priorities, dispute resolution. In practice, this power has gone to party bureaucrats and state officials, creating new hierarchies, new forms of domination, often more arbitrary and oppressive than market relationships. At least in markets, you can switch employers, move locations, start a business. Under central planning, the state controls your employment, your residence, your options. If the state is your only employer, you have no bargaining power. If the party controls everything, dissent becomes impossible. The concentration of economic and political power in the same hands creates totalitarianism. So we're left with a dilemma. Market economies create economic inequality that undermines the political equality they claim to support. Planned economies concentrate power that creates new inequalities and suppresses freedom. Is there a way to achieve meaningful equality without sacrificing liberty? Some theorists have proposed alternatives: market socialism with worker-owned firms competing in markets, universal basic income to provide material security without central planning, wealth taxes to prevent concentration, democratic participation in workplace governance. These might balance equality and freedom better than either pure capitalism or pure socialism, but we're speculating now. What we know is that the tension between equality and other values, liberty, merit, efficiency, hasn't been resolved. Every society must make trade-offs, accept some inequality to preserve some freedom, or accept some constraints on freedom to reduce inequality. What Locke and Marx force us to confront is that these aren't technical questions with technocratic answers. They're fundamental moral questions about what kind of society we want to live in, what we value most, what trade-offs we're willing to accept. You spend 8 hours making chairs. At the end of the day, you've produced 10 chairs. How much are they worth? Who should decide? And who should benefit from their sale? These might seem like simple economic questions, but they're the heart of the conflict between Locke and Marx, between liberalism and socialism, because how you answer determines everything about how you think society should be organized. Locke's answer starts with labor. Remember his theory of property? You mix your labor with natural resources, and that mixture creates ownership. The unowned tree becomes your lumber when you cut it. The lumber becomes your chairs when you craft them. Your labor is what transforms worthless raw materials into valuable goods. This seems intuitive. The chairs wouldn't exist without your work. You created them. They're yours. You can sell them for whatever price someone will pay. If you sell them for more than your costs, that profit is yours too. You earned it through your labor. Now add complexity. You didn't make those chairs alone. You used tools someone else made. You worked in a workshop someone else built. You sold through a market someone else organized. Do these others deserve a share? The liberal answer is yes, but only if you agreed to it. If you rented the workshop, you owe rent. If you borrowed tools, you owe interest or payment. If someone sold your chairs, you owe commission. But these are all contractual obligations you voluntarily accepted. The surplus after meeting these obligations is yours. This framework treats labor as the source of value but respects property rights in tools and capital. The owner of the workshop didn't build your chairs, but they provided necessary means. They deserve compensation for that contribution, but only the amount you agreed to pay. Everything else is yours because your labor created it. But what if you're not the independent craftsman? What if you're a worker in someone else's factory? Now the situation reverses. You still do the work. Your labor still creates the chairs. But you don't own them. Your employer does. You get a wage agreed upon in advance. Your employer gets everything the chairs sell for, minus costs including your wage. That surplus, the profit, goes to the owner, not the worker. The liberal justification is that you agreed to this arrangement. You sold your labor for a wage. The employer took the risk, provided the capital, organized production. Profit is their reward. You got what you bargained for. Marx looked at this and saw not voluntary exchange but exploitation masked by contract. His labor theory of value is more radical than Locke's. For Marx, labor isn't just what creates property rights. It's what creates all value. Nothing has value unless human labor was invested in it. Natural resources are worthless until labor transforms them. Machines are accumulated labor from their production. Capital is dead labor. The only source of new value is living labor, workers actually doing things. Now think about that factory worker again. They work 8 hours. In the first 4 hours, they produce enough value to cover their wage. But they don't stop at 4 hours. They work the full 8. Those additional 4 hours create surplus value that goes entirely to the capitalist as profit. This isn't compensation for the capitalist's contribution. The capitalist didn't create that surplus value. The worker did. The capitalist claims it purely through ownership of the means of production. This is exploitation in a precise technical sense, appropriating value you didn't create because of your property position. The capitalist might object, I provided the factory, the machines, the raw materials. Don't these contribute value? Marx's response is subtle but devastating. Yes, these things are necessary for production, but they don't create new value. They transfer their own value, created by past labor, to the product. The machine worth $10,000 gradually transfers that value as it depreciates. But it doesn't add value beyond what was invested in creating it. Only living labor creates new value. The worker using the machine creates more value than the machine transfers. That difference, that surplus, is the source of profit. And it exists only because the worker is paid less than the value they create. Why are they paid less? Because the labor market isn't equal negotiation between employer and employee. The employer has capital and can wait. The worker needs to eat today. Competition among workers drives wages down towards subsistence. The worker accepts less than they produce because the alternative is starvation. This analysis is powerful because it reframes the entire economy. What looks like mutually beneficial exchange is actually systematic extraction. What looks like fair wages is actually workers receiving only a fraction of what they create. What looks like profit from risk and innovation is actually unpaid labor. And it gets darker. The capitalist doesn't pocket all the surplus value as personal consumption. Much of it gets reinvested, buying more machines, hiring more workers, extracting more surplus. Capital accumulates, grows, expands its dominance. The worker, meanwhile, remains a worker, can't accumulate, stays trapped in the same position. Over time, this process concentrates wealth and power. A small class of capitalists owns increasing shares of the economy. A large class of workers owns nothing but their labor power, which they must sell on increasingly unfavorable terms. Inequality grows not despite capitalism functioning well, but because it's functioning exactly as designed. For Marx, this exploitation is the core injustice of capitalism. It doesn't matter if workers are treated kindly or paid relatively well. The structure itself is exploitative because some people live off the labor of others simply through property ownership. The solution is obvious. Abolish private ownership of the means of production. When workers collectively own the factories, the full value they create goes to them. No surplus is extracted by owners because there are no owners separate from workers. People receive the full value of their labor, as Locke claimed they should, but capitalism prevents. This vision is compelling. It promises to realize the liberal ideal of labor creating property, but without the exploitation that occurs when some own means of production and others don't. It treats workers as the true source of value, entitled to what they create. But there are problems with Marx's labor theory of value, problems that even sympathetic economists acknowledge. First, if labor is the only source of value, how do you explain why some labor creates more valuable products than others? A skilled surgeon and an unskilled laborer might both work 8 hours, but the surgeon produces far more value. Is this because surgical labor is somehow more valuable per hour? If so, what makes it more valuable if not its usefulness, which is determined by demand, which reintroduces market factors Marx tried to eliminate? Second, how do you account for innovation and entrepreneurship? Someone figures out a new product people want or a more efficient production method. This creates enormous value. Is this labor? If so, how do you measure it? If not, where does the value come from? Third, what about risk? The capitalist invests money that might be lost if the venture fails. The worker receives a wage regardless. Isn't the profit partly compensation for bearing risk that workers don't bear? Marx had responses to these objections, but they're complex and not entirely convincing. He distinguished between simple and complex labor, arguing that complex labor creates more value per hour but can be reduced to multiples of simple labor. He argued that innovation is collective, building on past knowledge, and shouldn't be monopolized by individuals. He claimed that capitalist risk is socially unnecessary, an artifact of private ownership, not a genuine contribution. These responses don't fully resolve the problems, and that's important because the labor theory of value isn't just theoretical, it's the foundation for Marx's claim that capitalism is exploitative. If the theory is wrong, the whole edifice collapses. Modern economists mostly reject the labor theory of value. They argue that value comes from usefulness, scarcity, and subjective preferences, not labor time. Something is valuable if people want it and it's scarce. Labor is one cost of production, but not the measure of value. Prices are determined by supply and demand, not labor hours. This subjective theory of value supports market capitalism. If value comes from what people want, then markets, which aggregate preferences through prices, are the best way to allocate resources. Profit signals that you're creating something people value more than the resources you're using. Loss signals the opposite. But here's what's interesting. You can reject the labor theory of value and still recognize that workers often don't receive the full benefit of their contribution. You can accept subjective value theory and still see that bargaining power is unequal, that workers have fewer options than employers, that the resulting distribution might not be fair even if it's efficient. In other words, the specific mechanism might be different from what Marx described, but the phenomenon he pointed to, workers receiving less than they might in a more equal negotiation, is real. Modern labor economics talks about monopsony power, where employers have market power over workers and can pay less than they would in perfect competition. It talks about efficiency wages, where paying more than minimum increases productivity. It talks about rent seeking, where people extract value through market position rather than contribution. These concepts don't use Marxist language, but they point to similar realities. Compensation doesn't always match contribution. Power imbalances affect distribution. Markets don't automatically produce just outcomes. Locke's framework has problems too. If labor creates property, what about inherited wealth? The heir didn't labor for it. Why do they have a right to it? Locke's answer was that parents have the right to provide for children, and property rights include right of transfer. But this means the current distribution of property doesn't reflect labor, it reflects historical accidents of birth. And if labor creates property, what about land and natural resources? No one created these, they existed before humans. How can anyone claim exclusive ownership? Locke said you can claim what you improve through labor, but only when there's enough left for others. In a finite world with growing population, this proviso can't be satisfied. Every claim excludes others from something they didn't create and might need. These problems suggest that neither Locke's nor Marx's labor theory fully captures how value and property work. Labor matters, but so does skill, knowledge, innovation, organization, and yes, capital investment. The question is how to distribute the joint product of all these factors fairly. Markets distribute based on bargaining power and property rights. This is efficient but not obviously just. Central planning distributes based on bureaucratic decision. This allows for fairness in principle but is inefficient and corruptible in practice. Worker cooperatives distribute based on democratic decisions among workers. This might balance justice and efficiency better, but hasn't been tried at scale. What's undeniable is that how you think about labor and value shapes your entire political worldview. If you think markets fairly compensate contributions, you'll support capitalism. If you think capitalism systematically exploits workers, you'll support socialism. And if you think reality is messier than either theory suggests, you'll support something in between. It's 1848. Revolutions are sweeping Europe, monarchies are falling, workers are organizing, the old order is crumbling. Karl Marx publishes the Communist Manifesto, ending with those famous words, "Workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains." Compare this to Locke, writing a century and a half earlier, carefully, anonymously, making arguments that could get him killed, but doing so through philosophical reasoning, not revolutionary rhetoric. His work justified the glorious revolution of 1688, but a peculiar kind of revolution, one that restored traditional rights, limited monarchical power, and established parliamentary supremacy without mass upheaval. These contrasting styles reflect fundamentally different views about how change happens and should happen. For Locke, change should be gradual, constitutional, based on consent. Yes, people have the right to overthrow tyrannical government, but this is a last resort, to be exercised only when government systematically violates natural rights and peaceful remedies are exhausted. Revolution isn't something to pursue, it's something forced upon you by intolerable oppression. Most of the time, change should happen through existing institutions. Representative government allows for peaceful evolution. Pass new laws, adjust policies, reform institutions, all without violence or disruption. This respects stability, which is itself valuable. Sudden change creates chaos, suffering, unintended consequences. Better to improve gradually than risk destroying everything in pursuit of perfection. This conservative temperament permeates liberal thought. Don't assume you can redesign society from scratch. Respect institutions that evolved over time because they probably serve functions you don't fully understand. Change one thing at a time so you can observe effects. Preserve what works while fixing what doesn't. There's wisdom here. Revolutionary upheaval does create chaos. The French Revolution, which Locke didn't live to see but which vindicated his caution, descended into terror and dictatorship. Destroying existing structures without viable replacements creates power vacuums, suffering, often outcomes worse than what you started with. And liberal societies have proven capable of reform. Slavery was abolished, women gained rights, labor conditions improved, social safety nets were established. None of this required revolution. It happened through legislation, social movements, gradual shifts in norms. Evolutionary change worked. But Marx looked at this evolutionary optimism and saw either naivety or bad faith. Change doesn't happen because people recognize injustice and decide to fix it. It happens through struggle, conflict, force. The powerful never voluntarily surrender power. Why would they? They benefit from existing arrangements. They'll make minimal concessions to prevent overthrow, but they won't fundamentally transform structures that serve their interests. Every gain workers made, every right secured, every reform passed, came through militant organization, strikes, sometimes violence. Capitalists didn't grant 8-hour workdays out of kindness. Workers fought for them. Women didn't get the vote through persuasion. They demanded it through protest. Civil rights weren't gifts. They were won through mass movements. And these reforms, while real, don't change the fundamental structure. Workers still work for owners. Capitalists still appropriate surplus value. The state still primarily serves property interests. Reform is like rearranging furniture in a burning house. It might make things slightly better temporarily, but it doesn't address the core problem. For Marx, the core problem is capitalism itself, and capitalism can't be reformed away. It's not a set of bad policies you can change. It's a system of production organized around private ownership and wage labor. Either you have capitalism or you don't. There's no middle ground. Revolution is therefore necessary. Not because Marx loved violence, but because he believed the ruling class would never peacefully relinquish power. History showed that every previous transformation, from slavery to feudalism to capitalism, involved violent upheaval. Why would the transition to socialism be different? The working class must organize, develop class consciousness, recognize their collective power, and overthrow the capitalist class. This requires revolution, seizing state power, expropriating the expropriators. It won't be granted through electoral politics or gradual reform. It must be taken by force. This revolutionary vision is both inspiring and terrifying. Inspiring because it promises fundamental transformation, an end to exploitation, justice for the oppressed. Terrifying because it normalizes violence, dismisses compromise, and assumes the righteousness of the revolutionary cause justifies any means. And empirically, revolutions have been nightmares. The Russian Revolution established totalitarian dictatorship. The Chinese Revolution killed millions. The Cambodian Revolution created genocide. Every Marxist revolution that succeeded in taking power created outcomes horrifying even by the standards of the capitalism they replaced. Why? Defenders of liberalism say it's inevitable. Revolutionary movements attract extremists, use violence that becomes self-perpetuating, and concentrate power in ways that enable tyranny. The suspension of normal rights during revolution never ends. The temporary dictatorship becomes permanent. The movement that promised liberation delivers oppression. Marxists respond that these weren't true implementations of Marxist theory, that revolutions occurred in backward conditions under siege, that Stalinism betrayed socialist principles. But at some point, the pattern suggests the problem is structural. Revolutionary seizure of power creates dynamics that resist democratic control. There's another issue, the assumption that capitalism will inevitably collapse. Marx predicted that internal contradictions would destroy capitalism. Falling profit rates, overproduction crises, growing inequality would make the system unsustainable. Workers would become increasingly immiserated until revolution was inevitable. This hasn't happened. Capitalism has proven far more resilient and adaptable than Marx expected. It survived depressions, wars, crises. It spread globally. Living standards for workers in capitalist countries have generally risen, not fallen. The revolution Marx thought inevitable hasn't occurred in advanced industrial societies where he expected it. Why not? Partly because of reforms Marx thought impossible. Welfare states, labor rights, progressive taxation. These weren't predicted by Marxist theory. They modified capitalism enough to prevent revolutionary pressure from building. Partly because capitalism generates enough growth to improve absolute conditions even while inequality persists. Partly because nationalist and ethnic identities prove stronger than class consciousness. But Marxists can point to continuing problems. Capitalism still produces crises. Inequality is growing again after mid-century compression. Environmental destruction threatens civilization. Financial instability creates recurring disasters. Maybe revolution was delayed, not prevented. Maybe the contradictions are building toward future rupture. The debate between revolution and evolution isn't just historical, it's ongoing. Every social movement faces this choice. Do you work within the system or against it? Do you pursue incremental change or fundamental transformation? Do you accept compromise or hold out for justice? Climate activism faces this. Do you push for carbon taxes and regulations, working through existing institutions? Or do you demand complete system change, arguing that capitalism is inherently incompatible with environmental sustainability? Racial justice faces this. Do you pursue police reform, voting rights, representation within existing structures? Or do you argue that institutions built on slavery and colonialism can't be reformed, only abolished and rebuilt? Economic justice faces this. Do you push for higher minimum wages, stronger unions, better social programs? Or do you argue that capitalism is unreformable and only socialism can deliver justice? These aren't easy questions. The evolutionary approach might be too slow, might miss opportunities for fundamental change, might get co-opted and defanged, but the revolutionary approach risks everything, often delivers outcomes worse than the status quo, and might be politically impossible anyway. What history suggests is that the most successful changes combine elements of both. Social movements create pressure, sometimes including disruption and militancy. Political actors respond with reforms that address legitimate grievances. The threat of revolution makes evolution possible. The possibility of evolution prevents revolution. This is messy, unsatisfying to both pure liberals and pure Marxists. But it might be how change actually works in complex societies, not through spontaneous order or revolutionary rupture, but through ongoing struggle and negotiation between groups with different interests and power. There's one more dimension to this question that's crucial. Can human nature change, or is it fixed? Locke thought human nature was relatively fixed. People are rational, self-interested, capable of moral reasoning and restraint. You can't radically transform this. You can only create institutions that channel these constants toward beneficial outcomes. Marx thought human nature was historically variable, shaped by material conditions and social relations. Capitalism creates competitive, selfish, alienated humans. Socialism would create cooperative, generous, fulfilled humans. Change the economic base and you change human psychology. This disagreement is fundamental because it determines what's possible. If human nature is fixed, then systems must accommodate it. If it's malleable, then revolutionary transformation is possible. The evidence is mixed. Humans do seem to have consistent tendencies: parental attachment, reciprocity, status seeking, tribalism. But behavior also varies enormously across cultures and historical periods. We're capable of both extreme selfishness and extreme altruism, both violence and cooperation. Perhaps the truth is somewhere in between. Human nature has consistent elements that systems must respect, but it's also plastic enough that different systems produce different behavioral patterns. You can't create utopia by transforming human nature, but you also can't assume current behaviors are inevitable. This means both Locke and Marx were partially right. You can't revolutionize society while ignoring human constants. But you also can't assume that because people behave certain ways under capitalism, they'd behave the same way under different systems. The practical implication is that change should be both ambitious and humble. Ambitious enough to pursue real improvement, not just tinkering. Humble enough to recognize limits, unintended consequences, and the dangers of overconfidence. Whether that means evolution or revolution probably depends on circumstances. Sometimes systems are reformable and evolution works. Sometimes they're so oppressive and rigid that only revolutionary pressure creates change. The question is which situation you're in, and reasonable people disagree. What's certain is that both stagnation and reckless upheaval have costs. Finding the right pace and method of change is perhaps the central challenge of politics. Locke would say individual, obviously. Yes, you're shaped by experiences, influenced by culture, connected to others. But at your core, you're a distinct person with your own thoughts, desires, rights. Your identity doesn't depend on society. It exists prior to and independent of any social arrangement. This primacy of the individual is the foundation of liberalism. Rights belong to individuals. Consent comes from individuals. Justice means treating individuals fairly. Collectives, groups, societies, these are just aggregations of individuals. They have no independent existence or moral status. This view has radical implications. It means you can't sacrifice individuals for collective good without their consent. The needs of the many don't automatically outweigh the needs of the one. Each person counts separately. Each deserves respect. Treating people as mere means to social ends violates their dignity. And it means freedom is fundamentally individual. You're free to the extent that you can make your own choices, pursue your own goals, live according to your own values. Collective goals are fine if everyone agrees, but they can't be imposed on dissenting individuals. Your life is yours to direct. This individualism resonates deeply in modern Western culture. We value autonomy, self-expression, personal achievement. We resist conformity. We celebrate uniqueness. We believe everyone should be free to become who they want to be. But Marx looked at this atomized individual and saw an abstraction, a fiction that obscures social reality. Humans don't exist as isolated atoms. We're born into families, cultures, languages, economies. Everything about us, our thoughts, desires, even our sense of self, is socially constructed. You don't choose your native language. You don't create your values from scratch. You inherit them from the social world you're born into. More fundamentally, human beings produce things together. We're cooperative by nature. One person alone can barely survive. Humans thrive through collective labor, division of tasks, mutual aid. The individual doesn't create wealth alone, then enter society to trade. Production is inherently social. The worker in a factory is part of a collective process, not an independent producer. Under capitalism, this social nature of production is obscured. Everything appears as individual exchange. You sell your labor, you buy commodities, you own property. But behind these individual transactions are vast networks of social cooperation that make them possible. For Marx, taking the individual as the basic unit of analysis is ideology, not truth. It naturalizes capitalism by making individual property ownership seem foundational when it's actually historically specific. It justifies inequality by treating people as separate rather than recognizing their mutual dependence. The alternative is to start with the collective. Humans are social beings. Our flourishing depends on collective conditions: education, infrastructure, culture, knowledge accumulated over generations. We should organize society to serve collective welfare, not protect individual rights that enable some to dominate others. This doesn't mean everyone must be identical or that individual preferences don't matter. It means that individual good is inseparable from common good. You can't flourish alone. Your well-being depends on social conditions. Therefore, improving collective conditions improves individual lives. And it means that individual rights shouldn't trump collective needs. If private property creates poverty and exploitation, it should be abolished even if owners object. If workplace organization is inefficient or unjust, workers collectively should reorganize it even if management disagrees. The collective, specifically the working class majority, should determine social arrangements. This collectivist vision promises solidarity, community, and end to alienation. Instead of competing against each other, we'd cooperate. Instead of pursuing private gain, we'd work for mutual benefit. Instead of hierarchy and domination, we'd have democratic participation. But there's a dark side to collectivism, one liberal critics emphasize. Who decides what collective interest is? In practice, someone must speak for the collective. That someone gains enormous power to override individual dissent in the name of collective good. And people disagree about what's good. Some want economic security, others want freedom to take risks. Some value tradition, others value change. Some prioritize material welfare, others prioritize meaning. How do you resolve these disagreements? Liberalism says let individuals choose for themselves. Collectivism says defer to collective decision. But that means the collective, or whoever speaks for it, can impose on individuals who disagree. History shows this isn't hypothetical. Every collectivist regime has suppressed individual dissent. If you disagree with the collective goal, you're selfish, reactionary, an enemy. Your individual rights are subordinated to collective needs, as determined by the party, the state, the leader. The Soviet Union suppressed art that didn't serve collective purposes. Maoist China sent intellectuals to labor camps. Cambodia murdered people for wearing glasses, a sign of individual learning. These aren't accidents or betrayals. They're what happens when collective good overrides individual rights. Defenders of Marx argue this confuses collectivism with authoritarianism. Democratic collectivism, where the collective truly governs itself, would respect diversity while pursuing common goals. The problem wasn't too much democracy, it was too little. Maybe. But the question remains, how do you actually organize democratic collectivism at scale? In small communities, consensus might be possible. Everyone knows each other, shares values, can discuss and compromise. But in societies of millions, how do you make collective decisions without creating bureaucracy, hierarchy, power imbalances? Liberalism's answer is don't try. Instead of collective decision-making about everything, limit collective decisions to narrow domains, politics, and public goods, and let individuals make their own choices about most of life. This avoids the need for impossible consensus. But this creates its own problems. By limiting collective action, it leaves problems unsolved. Environmental destruction requires collective restraint. Public health requires coordinated response. Economic stability requires regulation. Just leaving things to individuals isn't sufficient. And extreme individualism creates alienation, the very thing Marx criticized. People become isolated, competitive, lonely. Community dissolves. Social bonds weaken. Everyone pursues private goals in private spaces. This might protect freedom, but it impoverishes life. Modern societies try to balance individual and collective. We have individual rights, but also collective institutions. We have private property, but also public goods. We have personal freedom, but also social obligations. This balance is unstable, constantly contested, never perfect. The question is whether the balance can hold or whether forces push toward one extreme or the other. Economic pressures might push toward more collectivism as interdependence increases. Cultural forces might push toward more individualism as people value autonomy. What's striking is how both individual and collective are real and necessary. Pure individualism is impossible. We're inherently social. Pure collectivism is oppressive. We're also distinct persons with our own perspectives. The challenge is honoring both without sacrificing either. Locke saw the individual as primary and built institutions to protect individual rights while allowing collective action. Marx saw the collective as primary and imagined abolishing institutions that divide people into separate, competing individuals. Neither vision is fully satisfying because human reality includes both individual and collective dimensions irreducibly. Perhaps the deepest question is whether this tension can be creative rather than destructive. Can individual freedom and collective solidarity reinforce each other? Can protecting individual rights actually strengthen community by preventing domination? Can pursuing collective welfare actually enhance individual flourishing by creating better conditions for everyone? Or is it a zero-sum choice where more of one means less of the other, where you must ultimately decide whether you value liberty or solidarity more? Locke was obsessed with religion, not surprising for someone living through religious wars that killed millions. His letter concerning toleration argued that government shouldn't enforce religious belief. Faith must be voluntary. Coerced worship is worthless. Different people interpret scripture differently. Forcing uniformity creates hypocrisy and violence. This seems obvious now, but it was radical then. It suggested that truth might be plural, that people could sincerely disagree about ultimate questions, that coexistence was possible despite deep moral differences. Religious toleration became the foundation for broader liberalism. If we can tolerate different beliefs about God, we can tolerate different beliefs about politics, morality, the good life. But Locke's toleration had limits. He thought atheists couldn't be trusted because they had no divine motivation for keeping promises. He thought Catholics were dangerous because they owed allegiance to a foreign power, the Pope. Toleration extended to different Protestant sects, not to everyone. Still, the principle was revolutionary. It separated religious and political authority. It treated conscience as individual. It made space for diversity. And it assumed moral truths existed independently of particular religious traditions, accessible to reason. Natural law, knowable through rational reflection, provided common ground. This faith in natural morality is central to liberal thought. You don't need religion to know murder is wrong, theft is unjust, promises should be kept. These are rational moral truths, part of natural law. Different religions might express them differently, but they're universal. Marx had zero patience for this. Religion, Marx famously wrote, is the opium of the people. It soothes suffering without addressing causes. It promises justice in the afterlife while accepting injustice now. It tells the poor to be patient, humble, accepting because their reward will come in heaven. It legitimizes existing power structures by making them seem ordained by God. For Marx, religion isn't a private matter about ultimate truth. It's a social phenomenon serving specific functions. In class societies, religion helps the ruling class maintain control. It teaches workers to accept their position, discourages rebellion, channels dissatisfaction towards spiritual rather than material solutions. Think about traditional Christian morality. Blessed are the meek, the last shall be first. It's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. These teachings make poverty seem virtuous and wealth suspicious. Nice sentiments, but they don't challenge the structure that creates poverty. They just help people cope with it. And notice what religion emphasizes. Individual sin, personal salvation, private morality. Am I living righteously? Will I be saved? These questions direct attention inward, away from collective action, social transformation, class struggle. Religion individualizes problems that are structural. For Marx, morality itself is ideological. There's no universal moral truth accessible to pure reason. Moral ideas reflect material conditions and class interests. What seems like eternal justice is actually historically specific, serving whoever benefits from current arrangements. Consider property rights. Locke treated them as natural moral truths, but Marx saw them as serving capitalist interests. Of course, property owners think property is sacred. Of course, they develop moral philosophies justifying ownership. Their morality reflects their position. Or think about contract. Liberals treat voluntary agreement as the foundation of moral obligation. If you agreed, you're bound. But Marx saw that what counts as voluntary depends on your options. The worker who agrees to exploitative terms because the alternative is starvation isn't really consenting. The ideology of free contract obscures coercion. This is a devastating critique because it suggests that what we think of as moral reasoning might just be rationalization of our interests. We don't discover moral truth through neutral reason. We develop moral beliefs that justify our position and attack our rivals. Liberals obviously resist this. They argue that moral relativism is self-defeating. If all morality is just ideology, then Marxism is just ideology too, no better than what it criticizes. Why believe Marx's claims about justice and exploitation if there's no objective moral truth? Marx would respond that his analysis isn't moral but scientific. He's not saying capitalism is wrong because it violates eternal justice. He's saying capitalism is exploitative because of how surplus value is extracted. He's not appealing to morality but describing material reality. But this doesn't quite work because Marx clearly thought exploitation was bad, that workers deserve better, that socialism would be more just. These are moral claims, not just empirical descriptions. Marx needed moral premises even while claiming to transcend morality. There's a deeper issue here about human motivation. Why do people fight for justice, sacrifice for others, risk their lives for causes? Liberal theory has trouble explaining this. If everyone is rationally self-interested, why not free ride? Why participate in collective action when you can benefit without contributing? Marx's answer was class consciousness. Workers recognize their collective interest, develop solidarity, commit to the movement. But this just rephrases the question. Why does recognizing collective interest motivate action? How does class consciousness overcome individual self-interest? Religion, ironically, has an answer. People are motivated by belief in something greater than themselves, by faith, by moral conviction. They sacrifice because they believe it's right, because they fear divine judgment, because they seek meaning. But if religion is just ideology, if morality is just rationalization, where does motivation come from? Neither Locke's rational self-interest nor Marx's class consciousness fully explains why people become martyrs, saints, revolutionaries. Maybe both men underestimated the role of moral psychology. Humans aren't just rational calculators or class members. We're also moral beings who need meaning, who care about justice, who sacrifice for ideals. This isn't reducible to individual interest or class position. Modern moral philosophy has moved beyond both Locke and Marx. It recognizes moral pluralism without pure relativism. Different traditions have genuine insights. Moral truth might be complex, contextual, sometimes genuinely disputed. But this doesn't mean anything goes. And contemporary societies manage to function despite deep moral disagreement. We don't agree about religion, ultimate values, the good life, but we cooperate, make laws, resolve disputes. This suggests that shared morality isn't necessary for social order, just shared procedures and mutual tolerance. This procedural liberalism would satisfy Locke more than Marx. It accepts that people will disagree about fundamental questions and creates mechanisms for coexistence despite disagreement. It doesn't require everyone to convert to the same worldview. But Marx would say this just obscures deeper conflicts. Sure, we tolerate different religions, different lifestyles, but we don't tolerate different positions on property, employment, economic structure. The fundamentals of capitalism aren't up for debate in liberal societies. That's not tolerance, it's enforced consensus. And he'd point out that procedural neutrality isn't really neutral. Laws that protect property aren't neutral between owners and workers. Markets that reward capital accumulation aren't neutral between rich and poor. The procedures themselves embody moral and political choices favoring particular interests. So we're back to the fundamental question. Can societies with deep value conflicts coexist peacefully, or must one worldview ultimately triumph? Locke's toleration assumes yes, we can disagree and cooperate. Marx's class analysis assumes no, fundamental interests, conflict and struggle is inevitable. History provides evidence for both. Democracies do manage pluralism relatively peacefully, but they also have ongoing conflicts over distribution, regulation, rights. These conflicts aren't just policy disagreements. They're deeper disputes about justice, freedom, human dignity. What's clear is that neither religious morality nor scientific materialism fully captures human ethical life. We're moral reasoners, but shaped by interests. We have universal impulses, but culturally specific expressions. We need meaning, but also material security. The challenge is building societies that accommodate this complexity without either imposing uniformity or descending into chaos. Theory is one thing, reality is another. Both Locke and Marx offered visions of how society should work, but the real test is what happened when people tried to implement these visions, and the results are complicated, troubling, and fascinating. Start with Locke's liberalism. Where has it been tried? The obvious answer is the United States, founded explicitly on Lockean principles: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, government by consent, constitutional limits on power, protection of property rights, separation of powers. The American experiment was liberalism in practice, and by many measures, it worked spectacularly. America became the wealthiest, most powerful nation in history. It attracted immigrants from everywhere seeking opportunity. It pioneered technologies, created vast industries, raised living standards beyond what previous generations could imagine. Individual freedom allowed for dynamism, innovation, prosperity. But look closer, and the picture complicates. America was founded on slavery, the complete negation of Lockean principles for millions of people. The land was taken from indigenous peoples through violence and betrayal. Women were excluded from political participation for over a century. Property requirements limited voting. The gap between liberal ideals and practice was enormous. Defenders of liberalism argue these were violations of liberal principles, not implications of them. Slavery contradicted natural rights. Its existence was hypocrisy, not logical consequence. And eventually, liberal principles did expand. Slavery was abolished, suffrage extended, civil rights enacted. The system was capable of self-correction. But Marx would ask, why did correction take so long? Why did it require civil war, mass movements, often violence? And why do inequalities persist despite formal legal equality? If liberalism is self-correcting, why are prisons filled disproportionately with poor people and minorities? Why does wealth concentrate despite equal opportunity rhetoric? Look beyond America. Britain, the birthplace of Locke's thought, built an empire through conquest and exploitation. Free markets at home, colonialism abroad, liberal principles for British citizens, oppression for subject peoples. France proclaimed liberty, equality, fraternity while colonizing Africa and Asia. The gap between liberal values and liberal practice wasn't accidental. It was structural. Liberal democracies did eventually decolonize, did extend rights, did create welfare states. But this took centuries of struggle, and the global economic system they created still features massive inequality between former colonizers and colonized. Liberal theory says everyone can prosper through trade and property rights. Reality shows persistent hierarchies, path dependencies from historical injustices, continued exploitation of poor countries by rich ones. Yet there's no denying that liberal democracies have delivered prosperity and freedom to more people than any previous system. Life expectancy has soared, extreme poverty has declined, technology has improved lives immeasurably. People in liberal democracies have rights, can criticize government, can change leaders peacefully. These aren't trivial achievements. Compare this to experiments in Marxist socialism, and here the record is genuinely grim. The Soviet Union is the paradigm case. The Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, promising workers' control, end of exploitation, socialist democracy. What they delivered was totalitarian dictatorship, mass murder, economic stagnation, and oppression on a scale that rivals or exceeds the worst capitalist abuses. Stalin's collectivization of agriculture killed millions through famine. The Great Terror executed hundreds of thousands and sent millions to gulags. Political dissent was crushed. Art and science were subordinated to party ideology. The working class, supposedly liberated, lived under surveillance and fear. And economically, after initial industrialization, the system failed. Central planning couldn't match market efficiency. Innovation stagnated. Consumer goods were scarce and poor quality. By the 1980s, the Soviet economy was collapsing, unable to compete globally. The system imploded not from external invasion, but internal dysfunction. China under Mao was arguably worse. The Great Leap Forward created famine, killing tens of millions. The Cultural Revolution destroyed education, culture, social trust. Intellectuals were persecuted. Traditional culture was attacked. Economic planning was disastrous. Only after Mao's death, when China introduced market reforms while maintaining authoritarian political control, did prosperity arrive. Cuba, North Korea, Cambodia, Vietnam, Eastern Europe under Soviet control, every Marxist experiment produced authoritarianism, economic failure, and suffering. Not one created the workers' democracy Marx envisioned. Not one achieved prosperity comparable to capitalist democracies. Not one allowed genuine political freedom. Defenders of Marx have explanations. These weren't real socialism. Marx envisioned revolution in advanced industrial democracies, not backward agrarian societies. He expected international revolution, not socialism in one country. The experiments occurred under hostile conditions, facing capitalist encirclement, civil war, sabotage. Stalinism betrayed Marxist principles. There's truth here. Russia in 1917 was poor, largely illiterate, with weak democratic traditions. Revolution occurred during World War. Western powers did intervene against the Bolsheviks. These conditions weren't ideal for implementing socialism, but at what point does the pattern become dispositive? Every Marxist revolution happened in poor countries. Everyone faced hostile external environment. Everyone created authoritarianism. Maybe these aren't coincidental failures. Maybe something about revolutionary seizure of power, central planning, and abolition of private property creates these outcomes regardless of intentions. The theoretical problem is that concentrating economic and political power in the same hands eliminates checks on abuse. In liberal democracies, government regulates business but doesn't own it. You can oppose government economically. You can change jobs, move locations, organize opposition. Under state socialism, government is your employer, your landlord, your only option. Dissent becomes impossible. And the information problem is real. Markets generate prices that signal scarcity and value. Without markets, planners must decide what to produce without this information. They can't know what millions of people want, what technologies are possible, what resources are available. The result is chronic shortages, surpluses, inefficiency. Incentive problems compound this. In markets, serving customers earns profit. Wasting resources causes loss. In planned economies, meeting quotas matters, but quotas are often arbitrary. The famous Soviet nail factory that produced one giant nail to meet its weight quota exemplifies the problem. Metrics replace genuine value creation. But advocates of socialism can point to successes, partial and mixed though they are. Nordic social democracies combine market economies with extensive welfare states, strong labor rights, high taxes. They achieve both prosperity and equality, low poverty rates, and high living standards. Isn't this socialism in practice? Marxists would say no. Nordic countries aren't socialist, they're capitalist with redistribution. Private ownership of means of production remains. Wage labor continues. Exploitation is mitigated, not eliminated. These are compromises, not socialism. But maybe compromise is the point. Maybe the dichotomy between pure capitalism and pure socialism is false. Maybe mixed systems work better than either extreme. Markets for efficiency, redistribution for equity, private property but regulated, individual freedom but social safety nets. This social democratic model has delivered impressive results. Quality of life in Scandinavian countries is high, inequality is moderate, social mobility exceeds that in more libertarian societies. People report high satisfaction, democracy is robust. The question is whether this model is stable or whether it's a temporary equilibrium that will eventually collapse toward one pole or another. Capitalist pressures push toward deregulation, tax cuts, privatization. Democratic pressures push toward more redistribution, more public provision, more regulation. Can the balance hold? There's also the question of scale and culture. Nordic social democracies are small, relatively homogeneous, with strong civic culture and high trust. Can the model work in large, diverse societies? America has tried elements of it, the New Deal and Great Society programs. Results are mixed. Welfare state exists, but is weaker than Europe's. Inequality is higher, social mobility is lower, political conflict is more intense. One interpretation is that liberalism works better than socialism, but that unregulated liberalism has problems requiring social democratic corrections. Pure markets create too much inequality and instability. Pure planning creates authoritarianism and stagnation. The sweet spot is market economies with strong welfare states, labor rights, and regulation. Another interpretation is that capitalism, even reformed capitalism, remains exploitative and unjust, but that revolutionary socialism is too dangerous and dysfunctional. The best we can do is mitigate capitalism's worst features while building alternative institutions, cooperatives, commons, democratic workplaces, prefiguring a better future. A third interpretation is that both liberalism and Marxism are products of their time, 19th century ideologies inadequate for 21st century challenges. We need new frameworks beyond individual versus collective, market versus plan, capitalism versus socialism. What's undeniable is that neither vision has been vindicated in pure form. Liberal societies achieve prosperity but struggle with inequality and stability. Socialist societies achieve equality but sacrifice freedom and efficiency. Mixed economies achieve both partially but face ongoing tensions. History suggests that political and economic organization is endlessly complex, contextual, and contested. Simple theories, whether liberal or Marxist, can't capture this complexity. What works depends on circumstances, culture, history, resources, external pressures. But history also reveals something both Locke and Marx understood: ideas matter. The spread of liberal democracy wasn't inevitable. It required people believing in individual rights, limited government, rule of law. Socialist revolutions required people believing in class struggle, collective ownership, worker power. Ideas motivate action, justify institutions, shape possibilities. The question for us is which ideas are worth believing in, which visions are worth pursuing, which experiments are worth trying, and that requires grappling not just with history, but with ongoing problems our societies face. Every theory has internal tensions, contradictions that its own principles expose. For both Locke and Marx, the most devastating criticisms come not from external opponents, but from pushing their logic to uncomfortable conclusions. Start with liberalism's problem of initial acquisition. Locke said you create property by mixing labor with nature. But nature belongs to everyone originally. How can you legitimately claim exclusive ownership of something everyone had equal claim to? Locke's proviso said you can appropriate as long as there's enough and as good left for others. But in a finite world with growing population, this condition can't be met. Every appropriation excludes others. So either private property is impossible, contradicting liberal premises, or we must accept that current property distribution rests on historical acts that violated the very principles meant to justify them. This isn't abstract. It matters for indigenous land claims, reparations for slavery, global inequality. If current property ownership descends from theft, conquest, and fraud, does liberalism's commitment to property rights require restoring what was stolen? Or does liberalism accept that past injustice is irreparable and current holdings are legitimate regardless of origin? Liberal theory has no good answer. Some argue that property becomes legitimate through time and social acceptance. Others argue that restitution is impossible to calculate and would create more injustice than it fixes. Others bite the bullet and say yes, massive redistribution is required to legitimize the system. This internal contradiction undermines liberal claims that property rights are natural and just. They might be useful, efficient, better than alternatives. But naturally just? The theory itself suggests otherwise. And there's another problem: liberalism's tension between liberty and democracy. If liberty means protecting individual rights against interference, what happens when democratic majorities want to redistribute wealth, regulate property, limit contracts? Democracy says the majority should rule. Liberalism says individual rights are inviolable. They can't both be absolute. American constitutional history is one long struggle with this tension. Courts protect property rights and economic liberty against democratic legislation. Progressives attack this as undemocratic. Libertarians defend it as protecting freedom. But there's no principled solution within liberal theory. Either you limit democracy to protect liberty, or you limit liberty to honor democracy. And here's a deeper problem. Liberalism assumes people are free, rational individuals capable of self-governance. But psychological research shows humans are deeply irrational, easily manipulated, subject to cognitive biases. We're not the rational actors liberal theory posits. We're influenced by advertising, framing effects, social pressure, emotional appeals. This matters because liberal theory justifies markets and limited government by assuming people know what's good for them and make rational choices. But if people are predictably irrational, maybe they need more protection, more regulation, more paternalism than liberalism allows. Yet paternalism contradicts liberal respect for individual autonomy. Libertarian paternalism tries to split this difference, structure choices to nudge people toward better decisions, while preserving freedom to choose otherwise. But this is philosophically unstable. If people are irrational enough to need nudging, why trust them with ultimate choice? If they're rational enough to choose freely, why nudge them? Liberalism also struggles with collective action problems. Individual rationality produces collective irrationality. Everyone benefits if we all restrict carbon emissions, but each individual benefits more by polluting while others restrict. Result: climate catastrophe. Liberal theory, focused on individual rights and choices, has trouble justifying the collective coercion needed to solve such problems. Marxism has its own internal tensions, perhaps more severe. The biggest is the dictatorship of the proletariat. Marx said workers must seize state power and use it to suppress the bourgeoisie. But who exercises this power? Workers collectively can't directly govern. Some subset must act in their name, but that subset then has power over other workers. How is this different from any other class dictatorship? Lenin's Vanguard Party was supposed to solve this. A disciplined revolutionary organization leading the working class. But this immediately creates hierarchy. Party leaders have power over rank and file. The vanguard has power over the class it claims to represent. And once in power, this vanguard becomes a new ruling class, with privileges, interests, and power separate from ordinary workers. Every Marxist revolution has followed this pattern. Revolutionary leaders claim to represent workers, but become dictators. The workers' state becomes a police state. The dictatorship of the proletariat becomes dictatorship over the proletariat. This isn't accidental, it's structural. Seizing state power to reorganize society concentrates power in ways that resist democratic control. Marx's response would be that the state will wither away once class antagonisms disappear. But why would those holding power voluntarily surrender it? History shows power, once concentrated, perpetuates itself. People in privileged positions develop interests in maintaining those positions. The dictatorship becomes permanent. There's also a tension between Marx's materialism and his revolutionary politics. If ideas are just reflections of material conditions, if consciousness is determined by economic base, how can revolutionary consciousness emerge before material conditions change? Marx needs workers to develop class consciousness and organize revolution while still living under capitalism. But his own theory suggests their consciousness will reflect capitalist relations. He tried to solve this by arguing that capitalism's internal contradictions would create conditions forcing workers to recognize their situation. But this is vague. Why would suffering create revolutionary consciousness rather than despair, religion, or fascism? Empirically, immiserated workers often turn to nationalism, racism, or authoritarianism, not socialism. And there's the problem of economic calculation under socialism. If you abolish markets and prices, how do you know how to allocate resources efficiently? Marx never answered this. He assumed abundance would make allocation easy. But abundance doesn't eliminate scarcity, it just raises the baseline. Even wealthy societies must choose: more healthcare or more education, more consumption now or more investment for future. Without prices, what guides these choices? Some socialists proposed labor vouchers. You receive vouchers based on hours worked, exchange them for goods. But this reintroduces market-like mechanisms and doesn't solve the calculation problem. How many vouchers should different goods cost? How do you determine that without prices reflecting supply and demand? Others propose participatory planning. Democratic assemblies decide production and distribution. But this is impractical at scale. Millions of people can't deliberate about millions of products and services. Someone must make decisions. That someone has power, creating new hierarchy. Marx also underestimated nationalism and identity. He thought class would be the primary identity, that workers across nations would recognize their common interests against capitalists. Instead, workers often identify more strongly with their nation, religion, or ethnicity than with their class. Nationalism has proven far stronger than class solidarity. This isn't just failure of consciousness. People genuinely have multiple identities and interests. A worker might benefit from socialist redistribution but also value national glory, religious tradition, ethnic solidarity. Reducing everything to class ignores this complexity. Both theories also struggle with technological change. Locke wrote before Industrial Revolution, Marx during its early phase. Neither anticipated computers, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, climate change. Do their frameworks still apply? For liberalism, if AI can do most human work, does everyone have natural right to property when labor creates nothing valuable? If genetic engineering can modify human nature, does natural rights theory still make sense? If climate change requires massive collective action, can liberal individualism respond adequately? For Marxism, if automation eliminates the working class, who makes revolution? If prosperity increases without class struggle intensifying, was the theory wrong? If environmental limits constrain growth, does post-scarcity communism become impossible? These aren't just theoretical puzzles, they're practical challenges our societies face, and neither Locke nor Marx provides clear guidance. What this suggests is that both visions are incomplete. They capture important truths but also miss things, have blind spots, internal contradictions. This doesn't mean we should abandon them. It means we should use them critically, taking insights while recognizing limitations. Locke's emphasis on individual rights, limited government, and consent remains valuable. But we need to address how property was initially acquired, how inequality undermines liberty, how collective problems require collective solutions. Marx's analysis of exploitation, class power, and ideology remains valuable, but we need to solve the political and economic problems that plague every attempt at socialism. How to organize production without markets, how to govern without creating new hierarchies, how to motivate without material incentives. Maybe the path forward requires synthesizing elements from both traditions while transcending their limitations. Protect individual freedom while recognizing social nature of human existence. Use markets for efficiency while correcting for inequality and externalities. Honor democratic participation while protecting minority rights. Acknowledge both competition and cooperation as human tendencies. This won't satisfy purists, but purity in political philosophy often means ignoring reality's complexity. Picture the world in 1800. Most people are farmers. Life expectancy is under 40. Most children die young. Travel is by foot or horse. Communication is word of mouth or letter. Medicine is primitive. Most people are illiterate. Life is hard, short, and limited. Now look at 2025. Life expectancy exceeds 80 in developed countries. Child mortality is low. We have cars, planes, instant global communication. Medicine cures diseases that once killed millions. Nearly everyone is educated. Material abundance was unimaginable 2 centuries ago. What created this transformation? The answer determines much of the debate between Locke and Marx. For liberals, the answer is clear: markets, property rights, and individual freedom. When people can keep what they create, they have incentive to innovate. When markets reward solving problems, entrepreneurs search for solutions. When government doesn't control everything, individuals can experiment, try new approaches, fail, and try again. The story liberals tell goes like this. Property rights let inventors profit from inventions, so they invent. Competition drives businesses to improve products and reduce costs, so they innovate. Consumer choice rewards whoever serves customers best, so quality increases. Capital accumulates and gets invested in new technologies. The whole system creates a feedback loop of continuous improvement. Look at where innovation happens. Silicon Valley, not state-run laboratories. Private companies, not government bureaucracies. Entrepreneurs in garages, not 5-year plans. The pattern seems clear. Freedom generates innovation. Control stifles it. And empirically, market economies have produced extraordinary technological progress. Capitalism in 2 centuries created more wealth and technology than all previous human history. This isn't coincidence. The system is designed to encourage innovation through profit incentives and competition. Every breakthrough that defines modern life came from this system. Electricity, automobiles, airplanes, computers, internet, smartphones, medical advances. Private companies seeking profit created these, not governments pursuing collective welfare. Why? Because profit signals what people value. If you create something useful, people buy it. You profit. This directs innovative effort toward actual human needs, and competition means you must continuously improve. Today's innovation becomes tomorrow's standard. You innovate again or die. This dynamic process, creative destruction as Schumpeter called it, constantly churns through old methods and creates new ones. Inefficient firms fail. Efficient ones succeed. Resources flow toward their best uses. No central planner could replicate this. Marx looked at the same history and saw something different. Innovation driven by exploitation and oriented toward profit rather than human need. Yes, capitalism innovates, but why? To extract more surplus value. Factory automation doesn't primarily help workers, it replaces them, increasing unemployment and driving down wages. New technologies increase productivity, but benefits go to owners, not workers. Innovation under capitalism serves capital accumulation, not human welfare. And look at what gets innovated. Enormous resources go toward creating marginal product differences for profitable consumer markets, while urgent human needs go unmet. We have countless smartphone apps, but millions lack clean water. We have sophisticated financial instruments, but children starve. Innovation follows profit, and profit doesn't align with need. Marx also pointed out that innovation is collective, building on accumulated knowledge, yet private ownership claims individual credit and profit. The inventor uses mathematics developed over millennia, techniques refined by countless workers, materials extracted by laborers. The innovation is social, but the profit is private. Moreover, capitalism's innovation creates instability. New technologies disrupt industries, destroy jobs, devastate communities. Creative destruction is creative for capitalists, but destructive for workers. The textile worker whose skills become obsolete, the town whose factory closes, these aren't abstractions. They're human suffering in the name of progress. And capitalism's innovation is environmentally disastrous. Profit drives exploitation of resources, pollution, waste. Technologies that would be sustainable but less profitable don't get developed. Technologies that are profitable but destructive spread rapidly. Climate change is capitalism's innovation turned catastrophic. For Marx, genuine innovation would serve human need, not profit. In a socialist society, collective decision-making would direct research toward solving real problems: disease, hunger, housing, education. Resources wouldn't be wasted on trivial product differentiation or planned obsolescence. Innovation would be democratically controlled and socially beneficial. This is appealing in principle. But here's the problem. Socialist societies haven't innovated well. The Soviet Union achieved rapid industrialization initially but then stagnated. It couldn't keep pace with capitalist innovation. By the 1980s, Soviet technology was decades behind the West. Why? The usual explanation is that without profit incentives and market competition, people don't innovate. Why take risks, work extra hours, or challenge established methods if there's no personal benefit? Why compete to serve customers if there are no customers choosing between alternatives? Central planning can direct resources toward research, and the Soviets did, achieving things like spaceflight. But central planners can't anticipate what innovations are possible or needed. They can pursue known goals, like reaching orbit, but they can't generate the constant stream of unexpected improvements that markets produce. And without competition, there's no mechanism separating good innovations from bad. In markets, bad ideas fail quickly. In planned economies, once planners commit to something, it continues regardless of results. Failure is hidden or denied. Resources are wasted on approaches that don't work. The comparison between East and West Germany is instructive. Same people, same culture, similar starting points after World War II. West Germany, capitalist, became prosperous and innovative. East Germany, socialist, stagnated. When the Berlin Wall fell, the difference was stark. This wasn't because Germans in the East were less intelligent or hardworking. It was systemic. But defenders of socialism can point to examples of state-driven innovation. The internet came from military research. GPS was developed by the government. Many medical breakthroughs originated in publicly funded universities. Smartphone technology built on decades of public research. The state can and does innovate. This is true but complicated. Government can fund basic research, especially high-risk work, without obvious profit potential. Private companies build on this research to create commercial products. It's a partnership, not pure market innovation. And government innovation has advantages. It can pursue long-term goals without quarterly profit pressures. It can research areas that won't be profitable but are socially valuable. It can share knowledge publicly rather than hoarding it for competitive advantage. Maybe the optimal system combines elements: public funding for basic research, private development of applications, patents limited to prevent monopoly but allow recouping investment, open source for some domains, proprietary for others. But this just shows neither pure market nor pure planning optimizes innovation. Markets work for many things but underinvest in basic research and public goods. Planning can direct research towards social goals but lacks mechanisms for efficient allocation and refinement. There's another dimension. Who benefits from innovation? Liberals argue that markets spread benefits widely. New technologies might start expensive, but competition reduces prices. Eventually, most people access things that were once luxuries. Smartphones, once rare and costly, are now ubiquitous. This is true, but incomplete. Benefits spread unevenly. Technologies that serve wealthy markets get developed. Technologies for poor people's needs don't, because they're not profitable. Tropical diseases affecting millions in poor countries receive little research compared to rich country ailments affecting far fewer people. Innovation follows money, not need. Marx would argue this proves markets distribute innovation unjustly. Socialism could direct innovation toward universal human welfare, not profit. But again, we lack evidence this works in practice. Socialist countries didn't outperform capitalist ones in developing and distributing beneficial technologies. Perhaps the real question isn't which system innovates more, but what kind of innovation we want. Capitalism generates constant product churn, marginal improvements, commercial novelty. This creates variety and progress, but also waste, inequality, and environmental damage. An alternative system might innovate less frantically but more deliberately, focusing on genuine improvements rather than planned obsolescence, prioritizing sustainability over growth, directing technology towards social welfare rather than private profit. But this requires coordination, planning, sacrifice of efficiency for other values. It requires people accepting less material abundance in exchange for sustainability and equity. It requires trusting planners to make better decisions than markets. These aren't easy sells. What's undeniable is that innovation has transformed human life, mostly for the better. We live longer, healthier, more comfortable lives than our ancestors. This is real progress, whatever its costs. The question is whether this progress can continue under current arrangements, or whether capitalism's innovation is running up against environmental and social limits. Can we innovate our way out of climate change, resource depletion, inequality? Or do these problems require different approaches, less innovation and more restraint? Locke and Marx both believed in progress, in human capacity to improve our condition. They disagreed about the path. But neither anticipated that progress itself might become problematic, that innovation might create existential risks, that growth might need limits. We face questions they didn't. How do we innovate sustainably? How do we ensure benefits spread justly? How do we control technologies that threaten human survival? Neither liberal markets nor socialist planning obviously answers these questions. Maybe we need new frameworks, beyond Locke and Marx, adequate to challenges they couldn't foresee. Or maybe we need to synthesize their insights. Liberal freedom with socialist planning, market efficiency with democratic control, individual innovation with collective benefit. Here's a truth both Locke and Marx understood but emphasized differently. Power corrupts. Wherever authority concentrates, whoever holds it will abuse it. The question is how to prevent this. Locke's solution was to divide power, check it, limit it, make it accountable. Don't trust anyone with too much authority. Separate legislative, executive, and judicial functions. Require elections. Protect rights that government can't violate. Create constitutional constraints. The genius of liberal democracy is that it doesn't rely on virtue. It assumes power holders will be self-interested and create structures that channel self-interest toward public benefit. This insight animated American constitutional design. Madison's Federalist 51 stated it explicitly. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. Since they're not, you must structure institutions so ambition counteracts ambition. The president checks Congress, Congress checks the president, courts check both, federalism divides power between levels, and rights protect individuals against all of them. This system has worked reasonably well for over 2 centuries. Power hasn't concentrated catastrophically. Tyranny has been mostly prevented. Peaceful transfers of power occur. Individual rights are mostly protected. It's imperfect, but compared to most human political history, it's remarkable. But there's a problem Locke didn't fully anticipate: private power. He focused on limiting government because government was the main threat in his time. But capitalism creates concentrations of private economic power that can dominate just as thoroughly as government. Massive corporations control markets, influence politics, shape culture. They're not democratically accountable. They're not bound by constitutional limits. They pursue profit, and their power lets them externalize costs onto workers, communities, and environment. A CEO has more impact on ordinary lives than most elected officials, but faces no electoral check. Wealth itself becomes power. Rich people influence elections through donations. They hire lobbyists to shape legislation. They own media that influences public opinion. They fund think tanks that produce favorable research. They can hire better lawyers, access better healthcare, ensure their children have better opportunities. Economic inequality translates directly into political inequality. For Marx, this isn't a bug in liberalism. It's the core feature. Liberal democracy creates formal political equality while preserving economic inequality. It protects everyone's rights while allowing massive power imbalances. It limits government while leaving private power unchecked. The result is that capitalists control society not through holding office but through controlling the economy. They don't need to be king, they just need to own the resources everyone depends on. Government must accommodate their interests or face capital flight, disinvestment, economic crisis. This is why Marx thought liberal democracy was a sham. Yes, workers can vote, but they vote for representatives who serve capitalist interests because the entire system depends on capital investment. Reforms are possible, but only within limits capital accepts. Fundamental change, threatening property rights or capitalist profit, will be blocked by those with economic power. And look at how power operates in capitalist societies, not through open coercion usually, but through structural pressure. The factory owner doesn't force workers to accept low wages at gunpoint. Economic necessity does the forcing. The landlord doesn't physically compel tenants to pay rent. The threat of homelessness does. Capitalism creates dependencies that function as effectively as direct domination. For Marx, the solution was obvious: abolish private ownership of the means of production. When economic power is socialized, when workers collectively control workplaces, when resources are democratically managed, this structural power disappears. Political democracy becomes meaningful because it's not undermined by economic hierarchy. But here's the brutal irony. Every attempt to implement this solution concentrated power far more catastrophically than capitalism ever did. The Soviet Union abolished private economic power but created a totalitarian state with absolute control over people's lives. The party controlled your job, your housing, your access to goods, your freedom to travel, your ability to speak. Power wasn't divided, it was totally concentrated in state bureaucracy and party apparatus. And corruption was endemic, perhaps worse than in capitalist societies. Party officials had privileges, access to special stores, better housing. They used positions for personal benefit. Without market discipline or democratic accountability, there was no check on abuse. The nomenclatura became a new ruling class, exploiting position just as Marx accused capitalists of exploiting property. Why did this happen? The liberal answer is that concentrating economic and political power in the same hands creates totalitarianism inevitably. Separating them, even imperfectly, provides essential protection. In capitalism, you can oppose government politically even if you are economically weak. In state socialism, opposing the state means opposing your employer, your landlord, the source of all resources. Dissent becomes impossible. The calculation problem matters here too. Without markets and prices, central planners allocate resources. This requires enormous bureaucracy. That bureaucracy has power without accountability. Officials make decisions affecting millions of lives with no feedback mechanism telling them if they're wrong. And the incentive problem is severe. In markets, self-interest drives service to others. Profit comes from satisfying customers. In bureaucracy, self-interest drives different behaviors. Following rules, pleasing superiors, avoiding blame. Result, inefficiency, corruption, abuse. So we have a dilemma. Capitalism creates private concentrations of power that corrupt democracy and exploit workers. Socialism creates state concentrations of power that corrupt absolutely and oppress citizens. Neither solution is satisfactory. Modern democracies try to split the difference, regulate private power to prevent monopoly and abuse, use progressive taxation to limit wealth concentration, fund campaigns publicly to reduce money's influence, protect workers' rights to organize, create social programs that reduce economic dependency. These reforms help, but don't solve the fundamental problem. Economic power still translates into political influence. Regulatory capture occurs when industries control their regulators. Wealth still buys better outcomes. Politicians still depend on wealthy donors. The system is better than unregulated capitalism, but far from Marx's vision of genuine democracy. And there's constant pressure toward deregulation, privatization, tax cuts for the wealthy. Economic elites use their power to reshape rules in their favor. Without vigilant opposition, the reforms erode. This suggests Marx was right that class conflict is ongoing, that gains must be constantly defended. But state power also grows and becomes corrupt. Government bureaucracies develop their own interests separate from citizens. Regulations become barriers protecting established firms. Public sector unions resist accountability. Social programs become inefficient and captured by administrators. Even social democratic states face corruption and bureaucracy problems. Perhaps the lesson is that all power, public or private, economic or political, tends toward corruption. The solution isn't eliminating one kind of power which just strengthens the other. It's checking all power through multiple mechanisms: elections, markets, courts, civil society, media, federalism, rights, transparency. This requires constant vigilance, ongoing struggle, active citizenship. It means neither trusting markets to self-regulate nor trusting government to benevolently plan. It means skepticism toward both capitalist celebration and socialist promises. Locke understood that government power must be checked. Marx understood that economic power must be checked. Both were right. Neither solution was sufficient. We need synthesis. Democratic control over both political and economic domains with sufficient division and accountability to prevent tyranny. What this looks like practically is contested. Worker cooperatives, stakeholder capitalism, strong unions balanced against market competition, public ownership of some sectors, private ownership of others, democratic planning for big decisions, markets for small ones. These questions don't have definitive answers, but recognizing that power corrupts, whether held by capitalists or commissars, is essential. And recognizing that limiting power requires multiple overlapping checks is crucial. Neither pure liberalism nor pure socialism provides adequate protection against power's tendency to corrupt. We need better frameworks, combining insights from both traditions while avoiding each one's blind spots and failures. Something remarkable happened in the 20th century that neither Locke nor Marx predicted. Capitalist democracies built welfare states. By the 1950s and 1960s, Western European countries and North America had created systems that seemed to contradict both pure liberal and pure Marxist theory. Private property remained, markets allocated most resources, but government guaranteed healthcare, pensions, unemployment insurance, education. Progressive taxation redistributed wealth. Workers had strong legal protections and union rights. Poverty declined dramatically. Inequality moderated. This wasn't the minimal night watchman state Locke envisioned. Government was massive, interventionist, actively shaping economic outcomes. But it also wasn't socialism. The means of production remained privately owned. Profit still motivated investment. Markets still determined prices. The welfare state emerged not from theory but from struggle and crisis. The Great Depression showed that markets could fail catastrophically. Mass unemployment, bank failures, economic collapse demonstrated that laissez-faire liberalism didn't guarantee stability or prosperity. Something had to change. World War II showed that government could mobilize resources, plan production, achieve extraordinary goals. If government could organize total war, why couldn't it organize economic security? Returning soldiers expected better than the unemployment and poverty of the 1930s. Labor movements were powerful, organized, militant. Workers demanded security, dignity, fair compensation. They had leverage, both economic through strikes and political through voting. Capitalists faced a choice: make concessions or risk revolution. The Soviet Union existed as an alternative model. Whatever its flaws, it offered full employment, guaranteed housing, universal health care. Western governments needed to demonstrate that capitalism could deliver security too. The Cold War wasn't just military, it was ideological competition over which system better served ordinary people. So welfare states were born from pragmatic compromise, not ideological conversion. Capitalists accepted higher taxes and regulation to preserve the system. Workers accepted private ownership in exchange for security and rights. Government expanded to mediate and maintain the balance. The results were impressive. From 1945 to 1975, Western democracies experienced unprecedented prosperity. The golden age of capitalism saw rapid growth, rising wages, declining inequality, expanding opportunity. The working class achieved living standards previous generations couldn't imagine. College became accessible, home ownership spread, healthcare improved, poverty plummeted. Social democratic parties implemented these reforms, but even conservative parties accepted the basic framework. There was consensus that markets needed regulation, that some redistribution was necessary, that government had responsibility for welfare. The question was how much, not whether. From a Lockean perspective, this seemed like dangerous overreach. High taxes violated property rights. Regulation restricted freedom. Welfare created dependency. Government grew too powerful. The path led towards socialism and tyranny. But defenders of the welfare state argued it actually saved liberalism. By addressing capitalism's instabilities and inequalities, it prevented radicalization. By providing security, it created conditions for genuine freedom. People trapped in poverty aren't free in any meaningful sense. By ensuring basic welfare, the state enabled people to actually exercise their liberty. And welfare states remained democratic, protecting individual rights and allowing peaceful political change. They weren't totalitarian. They proved that government intervention didn't inevitably lead to dictatorship, that you could have both markets and social protection. From a Marxist perspective, the welfare state was inadequate, a temporary band-aid on capitalism's fundamental contradictions. Workers still sold their labor. Capitalists still extracted surplus value. Exploitation continued, just in more comfortable conditions. Real liberation required abolishing wage labor and private ownership, not just regulating them. But welfare states did achieve something Marx thought impossible, significantly improving workers' conditions within capitalism. The working class in social democracies lived better than workers in any socialist country. This empirical reality was devastating to Marxist predictions that capitalism would immiserate workers until revolution became inevitable. Some Marxists argued that welfare states depended on specific historical conditions that were temporary: post-war growth, weak international capital mobility, strong unions, social cohesion, colonial exploitation of the Third World. Once these conditions changed, the welfare state would prove unsustainable. And in some ways, this prediction came true. Starting in the 1970s, the welfare state came under pressure. Economic growth slowed, inflation rose, unemployment increased. Stagflation challenged Keynesian economic management. Globalization allowed capital to move freely, undermining national regulation. Unions weakened. Conservative politicians attacked welfare programs as inefficient and immoral. Reagan and Thatcher led what they called a neoliberal revolution. Deregulation, privatization, tax cuts, welfare reduction, union busting. They argued that the welfare state had grown too large, stifling enterprise and creating dependency. Markets needed to be unleashed. Individual responsibility needed to be restored. Government needed to shrink. The results were mixed. Economic growth resumed in some countries. Innovation accelerated, but inequality increased dramatically. Poverty rose, job security declined. Financialization created new instabilities, culminating in the 2008 crisis. The promised prosperity didn't materialize for most people. European social democracies largely maintained their welfare states despite pressure, though with modifications. They proved more resilient than critics predicted. Nordic countries in particular combined generous social programs with competitive market economies, achieving both efficiency and equity. This suggests the welfare state isn't inherently unsustainable, but it requires political will to defend it. When workers are organized and vote, welfare states persist. When they're fragmented and disengaged, welfare erodes. The welfare state faces genuine challenges though. Aging populations strain pension and healthcare systems. Global competition pressures wages and taxes. Migration raises questions about who deserves benefits. Technological change threatens jobs. Climate change requires massive public investment. Can the welfare state adapt to these challenges, or was it a product of specific 20th century conditions that can't be replicated? Some argue for updating it: universal basic income to address automation, Green New Deal to combine climate action and employment, wealth taxes to fund expanded services, global coordination to prevent race to the bottom. Others argue for accepting its limits. Some inequality is inevitable and not unjust. Some responsibility must remain individual. Some services are better privately provided. Some risks can't be socialized. The debate continues because the welfare state sits uncomfortably between liberal and socialist principles. It's neither pure market nor pure planning. It's compromise, mixing elements that theoretically don't belong together. But maybe compromise is the point. Maybe both Locke and Marx captured partial truths, and the welfare state synthesizes them pragmatically: markets for efficiency, regulation for stability, private property for innovation, public provision for security, individual freedom with collective insurance. This isn't philosophically pure. It creates tensions, contradictions, ongoing political conflict, but it's delivered results better than either extreme, and it shows that dichotomies between capitalism and socialism, individual and collective, market and state, aren't as absolute as theory suggests. The welfare state is an experiment, still ongoing, still contested, still evolving. It might be humanity's most successful political invention, combining prosperity and security, freedom and solidarity. Or it might be a temporary equilibrium that will eventually collapse toward one pole or the other. What's clear is that neither pure liberalism nor pure socialism adequately describes or prescribes for modern democracies. We live in hybrid systems, combining elements both Locke and Marx would recognize and both would critique. Understanding this complexity requires engaging with both traditions critically. In 1776, Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations, articulating liberal economic theory. He used the example of a pin factory. Division of labor increases productivity enormously. Specialization and trade create prosperity. This logic extends internationally. Countries should specialize in what they produce most efficiently and trade for everything else. Everyone benefits. 2 centuries later, this vision seemed vindicated. After World War II, international trade expanded dramatically. Tariffs fell, capital moved freely, supply chains spanned continents. Goods made in China were sold in America. Technology developed in Europe was manufactured in Asia. The global economy integrated like never before. For liberal economists, this was beautiful. Comparative advantage working on planetary scale, resources flowing to most efficient uses, competition driving innovation, prosperity spreading. Countries that embraced globalization grew rapidly. South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and eventually China. Poverty declined globally. Living standards rose. But Marx would recognize a pattern: capital going global to exploit labor wherever it's cheapest and regulations weakest. Globalization isn't mutual benefit. It's capitalism escaping national constraints, finding new populations to exploit, new resources to extract, new markets to penetrate. Look at what actually happened. Manufacturing moved from high-wage countries to low-wage ones. Workers in Detroit lost jobs to workers in Shenzhen. This increased corporate profits and lowered consumer prices but devastated communities. Factories closed, towns died, inequality within rich countries increased even as global inequality moderated. Environmental regulations were circumvented by moving production to countries with weaker standards. Labor protections were evaded similarly. The race to the bottom wasn't theoretical, it was real. Countries competed to attract capital by lowering wages, reducing regulations, cutting taxes. Workers everywhere faced pressure to accept worse conditions. Financial globalization created new instabilities. Capital flows could destabilize entire economies overnight. The 1997 Asian financial crisis, the 2008 global financial crisis, these weren't just market corrections. They were catastrophic disruptions causing immense suffering, and they spread globally because financial systems were interconnected. Power shifted from democratic governments to international institutions and corporations. Trade agreements were negotiated by elites, binding countries to rules that limited sovereignty. The World Trade Organization, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, these weren't democratically accountable but shaped economic policy worldwide. For defenders of globalization, these were growing pains. Overall benefits exceeded costs. Poor countries industrialized. Global poverty fell. Innovation accelerated. Yes, there were losers in rich countries, but they could be compensated through redistribution. The solution was more social spending, better adjustment programs, not retreating from globalization. But compensation didn't happen adequately. Workers displaced by trade didn't receive enough support. Communities hollowed out by capital flight were abandoned. The political coalition supporting globalization assumed markets and growth would solve problems. They didn't. The result was backlash. Populist movements emerged opposing globalization, immigration, free trade, Brexit, Trump, European nationalism. These weren't random. They were reactions to decades of policies that benefited capital and hurt labor, policies justified by liberal economic theory. Marx would say this was inevitable. Capitalism creates contradictions. Globalization intensifies them. Workers in rich and poor countries are played against each other. All face pressure to accept lower wages and worse conditions. Eventually they rebel, though often in reactionary rather than revolutionary directions. And globalization faces the coordination problems Marxists predicted. Climate change requires global cooperation, but capitalism creates competition. Each country wants others to reduce emissions while it continues growing. Each corporation wants competitors to bear costs while it maintains profits. The result is inadequate action, threatening civilization. Environmental destruction is globalized too. Deforestation in Brazil affects the entire planet. Plastic pollution in Asia ends up in every ocean. Industrial agriculture everywhere depletes soil and water. Capitalism's logic of endless growth confronts planetary boundaries, and something has to give. Migration is another challenge neither Locke nor Marx adequately addressed. People flee poverty, war, environmental disaster. They seek better lives. Liberal principles suggest they should be free to move, that borders are arbitrary. But nation-states claim the right to control who enters. When millions move, social tensions rise, welfare states face stress, political backlash intensifies. Technological change compounds everything. Automation threatens jobs globally. Artificial intelligence might displace not just factory workers, but knowledge workers. What happens when human labor becomes largely unnecessary? Locke's labor theory of property assumes labor creates value. Marx's theory assumes workers are essential to production. What if neither is true anymore? Digital technology creates new forms of power and inequality. Data is the new oil, concentrated in a few massive corporations. Surveillance capitalism knows everything about everyone, monetizing attention and behavior. Social media shapes political discourse, often toxically. These companies aren't democratically accountable, but profoundly affect society. And technology enables new forms of authoritarianism. China combines market economics with digital dictatorship, surveillance systems tracking citizens, social credit scores enforcing conformity, censorship controlling information. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Both liberals and Marxists assumed capitalism required democracy, or democracy would lead to socialism. China suggests other combinations are possible. Globalization also creates cultural tensions. Modern liberal cosmopolitanism says cultural particularity is less important than universal human rights. People should be free to choose identities, move between cultures, transcend traditional loyalties. But many people value cultural continuity, national identity, traditional communities. Globalization threatens these, creating resistance. Marx thought capitalism would create universal proletarian consciousness, transcending national and cultural divisions. It hasn't. Instead, we see fragmentation, nationalist, ethnic, religious identities often stronger than class consciousness. Globalization creates both homogenization and reaction, both cosmopolitanism and tribalism. How do we address these challenges? Liberalism suggests better global governance, international institutions with democratic accountability, global taxes on pollution and wealth, stronger labor and environmental standards in trade agreements, compensation for globalization's losers. But this requires unprecedented international cooperation and sovereignty sacrifice. Countries must agree to be bound by rules they might not like. The wealthy must accept redistribution globally, not just nationally. This seems politically impossible. Marxism suggests the problem is capitalism itself. You can't solve global inequality, environmental destruction, or economic instability while maintaining profit-driven production. You need global socialism, democratic control of production, planned reduction of consumption, equitable distribution of resources. But this seems even more impossible. We can't get countries to cooperate on modest climate goals. How would we implement global democratic planning? Who would enforce it? How would you transition without catastrophic disruption? Some propose degrowth, deliberately reducing consumption in rich countries to enable development in poor ones while staying within planetary boundaries. This combines elements of socialist planning with ecological necessity. But it requires people accepting lower material living standards, which is politically challenging. Others propose green capitalism, carbon taxes, renewable energy investment, circular economy, sustainable innovation. Markets can solve environmental problems if properly regulated and incentivized. This maintains growth while transitioning to sustainable technologies. Neither solution is proven. We're conducting a global experiment without really knowing what will work. What's clear is that both Locke's vision of beneficial market expansion and Marx's vision of revolutionary transformation are inadequate to current challenges. Globalization has created problems that national democracies can't solve alone and international institutions can't address without more cooperation than seems feasible. We face genuinely new challenges: planetary environmental limits, technological disruption of labor, global inequality, mass migration, digital surveillance, pandemics, artificial intelligence. Neither 18th century liberalism nor 19th century Marxism provides ready answers. Maybe we need new political philosophies, frameworks adequate to global interdependence and ecological limits. Or maybe we need to creatively apply old insights to new contexts, finding synthesis between individual freedom and collective planning, market efficiency and democratic control, national sovereignty and global cooperation. What we can't do is ignore the problems or pretend 18th and 19th century theories automatically transfer to 21st century realities. Both Locke and Marx offered profound insights, but both lived in different worlds with different challenges. We must think for ourselves, learning from them while transcending their limitations. After everything we've discussed, the failures of both visions, the limitations of both theories, the mixed historical record, you might wonder why people still identify as liberals or socialists, capitalists or Marxists. Why does the debate continue? The answer is that both Locke and Marx tapped into deep human needs and aspirations that don't disappear just because theoretical systems have problems. Liberalism appeals because humans value freedom. We want to make our own choices, pursue our own goals, live according to our own values. The idea that we have natural rights no one can violate, that we're entitled to keep what we earn, that government should leave us alone, this resonates deeply. There's something psychologically satisfying about liberal individualism. It treats you as responsible for your own life. Your successes are your achievements. Your failures are your responsibility. This is empowering. It suggests you have agency, that your choices matter, that you can improve your situation through effort. And liberalism offers a clear, simple framework. Protect property, enforce contracts, limit government, let markets work. These principles are easy to understand and apply. They promise that if we just follow them, prosperity and freedom will follow. This clarity is appealing in a complex, confusing world. Liberalism also aligns with observable aspects of human nature. People do pursue self-interest. They do respond to incentives. They do value their particular families and communities over abstract humanity. They do resent being forced to sacrifice for collective goals they didn't agree to. And liberal societies have delivered results. Wealth, innovation, opportunity, these exist more abundantly in liberal democracies than anywhere else. People vote with their feet, migrating toward liberal societies, not away from them. This empirical success sustains liberalism's appeal, but Marxism appeals to equally deep human needs. We want justice, we want solidarity, we want to believe our work matters and serves something beyond profit. The idea that exploitation is the core injustice, that liberation requires collective struggle, that a better world is possible, this resonates too. There's something psychologically satisfying about Marxist analysis. It explains why life is hard even when you work diligently. It's not your fault, it's the system. You're not failing, you're being exploited. This is validating. It channels frustration towards structural change rather than self-blame. And Marxism offers moral clarity in a different way. The world is divided into exploiters and exploited. Your side is determined by your relationship to means of production. Justice means workers owning what they produce. Liberation means abolishing class divisions. These are clear moral imperatives, not complicated trade-offs. Marxism also aligns with observable aspects of human nature. People do care about fairness. They do resent unjust inequality. They do seek meaning in work beyond just earning money. They do value community and collective achievement. They do rebel against domination. And capitalism does create problems Marxism identifies. Inequality is real and growing. Exploitation in various forms exists. Power is concentrated. Environmental destruction is real. These problems sustain Marxism's relevance even when Marxist solutions have failed. So both visions persist because both capture partial truths about human nature and social organization that won't disappear. Liberalism is right that humans value freedom and respond to incentives. Marxism is right that humans value justice and solidarity. Liberalism is right that concentrated power becomes tyrannical. Marxism is right that concentrated wealth becomes exploitative. Liberalism is right that markets can coordinate complex activity efficiently. Marxism is right that markets create inequality and instability. Neither is completely right or completely wrong. Both identify real phenomena, real values, real problems. That's why the debate continues, because there's truth on both sides and no perfect synthesis. There's also a psychological dimension. People's political beliefs correlate with personality traits. Those high in openness and tolerance for ambiguity tend toward left politics. Those high in conscientiousness and preference for order tend toward right politics. Some people are temperamentally inclined toward change, others toward stability. Locke's caution, incrementalism, and respect for tradition appeal to conservative temperaments. Marx's radicalism, critique of existing order, and revolutionary vision appeal to those uncomfortable with current arrangements. These aren't just intellectual disagreements. They're rooted in different psychological orientations toward risk, change, authority, and community. Political identity also provides meaning and belonging. Being a liberal or socialist isn't just holding certain beliefs. It's being part of a community, a tradition, a movement. It's having a framework for understanding the world, allies in struggle, enemies to oppose. This social dimension sustains ideological commitment beyond rational evaluation. And there's path dependence. Once you adopt a political framework, you interpret new information through it. Liberals see market successes and socialist failures. Socialists see capitalist crises and social democratic achievements. Both are looking at the same world but seeing different patterns because they have different frameworks. This doesn't mean political beliefs are just arbitrary or psychological. There are real arguments, real evidence, real stakes. But it helps explain why debate continues despite massive evidence of problems with both approaches. Neither side will simply concede because both are based on genuine insights and values. The persistence of this debate isn't a failure. It's a sign of irreducible complexity in political life. We face genuine trade-offs: freedom versus equality, efficiency versus stability, individual versus collective, growth versus sustainability. These trade-offs don't have objectively correct resolutions. They require ongoing negotiation, compromise, adjustment based on circumstances. Different societies make different choices. Nordic social democracies prioritize equality and security. America prioritizes individual freedom and economic dynamism. Both achieve good outcomes by some measures, poor outcomes by others. There's no proof that one approach is universally superior, and circumstances change. What works in one era or context might not work in another. The welfare state emerged from specific conditions and might need adaptation for different challenges. Neither preserving tradition nor revolutionary change is automatically correct. The appropriate response depends on the situation. This suggests we should hold political beliefs more tentatively, be willing to adjust based on evidence, combine insights from competing traditions. But humans aren't good at this. We want certainty, clear answers, good guys and bad guys. We want to believe our side is right and the other wrong. Maybe the best we can do is recognize the partiality of our own perspectives, the validity of some opposing concerns, the complexity that resists simple solutions. We can commit to values while acknowledging limits. We can pursue goals while adapting to reality. Both Locke and Marx were brilliant thinkers who identified important truths. Both also had blind spots, made predictions that didn't pan out, proposed solutions that didn't work. We honor them by learning from their insights while avoiding dogmatic adherence to their systems. The persistent appeal of both liberalism and socialism suggests they'll continue shaping political debate for the foreseeable future. We'll keep arguing about freedom versus equality, markets versus planning, individual versus collective. This isn't because we haven't found the right answer. It's because there isn't one right answer, just ongoing tension between valid competing values. We've spent this entire lecture exploring the conflict between Locke and Marx, liberalism and socialism, capitalism and communism. But what if the whole framework is wrong? What if the binary choice between these alternatives is a false dilemma? After all, neither pure liberalism nor pure socialism has been implemented successfully. Every real society is mixed, combining elements from both traditions in varying proportions. The question isn't which pure system to adopt, but how to balance competing values and approaches. Some contemporary political thinkers argue we need to move beyond both liberalism and Marxism entirely, developing new frameworks for new challenges. Feminists point out that both Locke and Marx focused on the public sphere of politics and economics, while ignoring the private sphere of family and reproduction. Both assumed workers were male heads of household. Neither adequately addressed unpaid care work, primarily done by women, that makes all other economic activity possible. A feminist lens reveals that both capitalism and socialism rest on exploitation of women's labor. Both assume someone will raise children, care for elderly, maintain households, provide emotional support. This work isn't compensated or even recognized as work. Any political economy must address this. Environmental thinkers argue that both liberalism and Marxism are growth-obsessed, assuming endless expansion is possible and desirable. Both emerged in an era when environmental limits seemed distant. Neither provides adequate framework for ecological crisis we face. Markets don't account for environmental costs. Profit incentives drive overconsumption and pollution, but central planning hasn't performed better environmentally. The Soviet Union had catastrophic environmental destruction. The challenge is subordinating economic activity to ecological limits, something neither system does well. Communitarians critique liberalism's atomized individualism, arguing humans are fundamentally social, shaped by communities, needing belonging and shared meaning. But they also reject Marxist class reduction, noting that people identify with families, religions, nations, cultures, not just economic positions. A communitarian approach would prioritize strengthening communities, local institutions, face-to-face relationships, shared traditions. Neither markets nor planning adequately addresses human needs for meaning, belonging, and dignity. Post-colonial thinkers note that both Locke and Marx were European theorists whose frameworks reflect European experience and often justified European domination. Locke's labor theory of property was used to claim indigenous lands. Marx's stage theory suggested colonialism was necessary for progress. Alternative frameworks from non-Western traditions might offer different insights. Indigenous concepts of land as commons, not property. African Ubuntu philosophy emphasizing mutual dependence. Asian traditions of harmony and collective welfare. Anarchists reject both liberal state and Marxist vanguard party, arguing all centralized authority becomes oppressive. They propose radical decentralization, direct democracy, voluntary association, horizontal organization. Small-scale experiments in anarchist governance have existed, but scaling up remains problematic. Technology enthusiasts think both liberalism and Marxism are outdated because technology transforms fundamental conditions. Automation might enable post-scarcity abundance, making distribution debates moot. Digital tools might enable new forms of coordination beyond both markets and planning. Artificial intelligence might solve problems human political systems can't. But technology optimism has its own problems. Automation so far has increased inequality, not eliminated scarcity. Digital tools are used for surveillance and manipulation as much as liberation. AI reflects biases of creators and might concentrate power further. Some propose hybrid systems combining best elements of competing approaches. Market socialism with worker-owned firms competing in markets. Stakeholder capitalism where companies serve multiple constituencies, not just shareholders, social wealth funds that democratize capital ownership, participatory planning for major decisions with markets for minor ones. These experiments are happening in small scale. Worker cooperatives exist and sometimes thrive. Some cities practice participatory budgeting. Some countries have sovereign wealth funds. Some companies practice stakeholder governance. Whether these can scale and how they'd interact with conventional systems remains unclear. Universal basic income is proposed as a way to maintain markets while ensuring security. Everyone receives unconditional income sufficient for basic needs. This preserves work incentives and market efficiency while preventing poverty and providing genuine freedom. Critics question whether it's affordable and whether it would actually reduce inequality or just subsidize low wages. Wealth taxes are proposed to address concentration of capital without abolishing private property. Tax wealth above certain thresholds. Use revenue for public investment or redistribution. This could limit inequality while maintaining market economy. But wealth is mobile and hard to measure, making enforcement challenging. Democratic workplace governance is proposed to address power imbalances without full socialism. Workers have representation in corporate decisions or elect boards or own shares. This exists in various forms in Germany, Scandinavia, and some American companies. Evidence suggests it can improve outcomes, but implementation varies and challenges exist. These aren't comprehensive alternatives to liberalism or socialism. They're adjustments, reforms, experiments. But maybe that's the point. Maybe there isn't one correct system we need to discover and implement globally. Maybe there are many possible arrangements, each with trade-offs, each suitable for different contexts. Different cultures might reasonably choose different balances between individual and collective, market and planning, freedom and security. What works for Sweden might not work for Singapore. What Americans prefer might not suit Chinese. Diversity of political economic systems might be inevitable and even desirable. This pluralist view rejects universalism of both liberal and Marxist thought. Both assume their system was objectively correct and should spread globally. But maybe political arrangements are more like languages. Many are possible, each functional in its context. Translation between them is imperfect, and expecting everyone to speak the same one is unrealistic. But pluralism faces challenges too. If there's no universal standard, how do we judge whether a system is just? If everything is relative to culture and context, can we criticize authoritarianism, slavery, exploitation? Don't we need some universal principles? And practical interdependence requires coordination. Climate change doesn't care about cultural diversity. Global markets create spillovers. Migration mixes populations. We need some common framework for cooperation even if domestic arrangements vary. Perhaps the solution is universal principles applied differently. Commitment to human dignity and freedom, implemented through culturally specific institutions. Protection against domination and exploitation, achieved through varying mechanisms. Democratic participation, taking different forms in different contexts. This would preserve Locke's insight about universal human rights, while allowing Marxist concern about economic exploitation to be addressed in culturally appropriate ways. It would reject both pure market fundamentalism and pure socialist planning while learning from both traditions. What's clear is that we can't simply choose between Locke and Marx, liberalism and socialism, as if these were the only options. Real political life is messier, more complicated, more contextual. We need frameworks sophisticated enough to handle complexity without dissolving into relativism. We need to synthesize insights from multiple traditions. Liberal concern for freedom, socialist concern for justice, feminist concern for care, environmental concern for sustainability, communitarian concern for belonging, post-colonial concern for dignity, anarchist concern for autonomy. This won't produce a simple, elegant theory like Locke's or Marx's. It will be complicated, full of tensions and trade-offs. But political life is complicated. Any theory pretending otherwise is either naive or dishonest. The challenge going forward is developing political wisdom, ability to navigate complexity, balance competing values, adapt to changing circumstances, learn from experience, maintain humility about our knowledge. This is harder than ideological certainty, but more honest and probably more effective. Both Locke and Marx contributed to this wisdom. We can learn from them, their insights and their errors, while moving beyond the binary opposition between their visions. We can appreciate how each captured important truths while recognizing that neither captured the whole truth. Political philosophy doesn't progress linearly toward right answers. It's ongoing conversation across time about perennial questions. How should we live together? How should power be organized? How should resources be distributed? What do we owe each other? What does justice require? Locke and Marx gave influential answers to these questions. Their answers shaped the modern world, for better and worse. Understanding them helps us understand where we are and where we might go. But ultimately, we must answer these questions for ourselves, in our time, facing our challenges. We can't simply apply 18th or 19th century theories to 21st century problems. We must think anew, building on past wisdom while transcending past limitations. The conversation between liberalism and socialism, Locke and Marx, continues because the tensions they identified are real and enduring. Freedom versus equality, individual versus collective, efficiency versus justice, stability versus change. These tensions won't be resolved. They'll be navigated, negotiated, balanced differently in different times and places. Our task isn't to declare one side victor. It's to engage seriously with both perspectives, understand what each gets right and wrong, and construct political arrangements adequate to our challenges while honoring our values. This is difficult, unglamorous work, but it's the work of democratic citizenship in complex times. And maybe that's the ultimate lesson from this lecture. The most important thing isn't choosing between Locke and Marx. It's developing the capacity to think critically about political questions, to recognize validity in competing perspectives, to make difficult trade-offs thoughtfully, to adjust based on evidence, to pursue justice and freedom simultaneously even when they tension. Both liberalism and socialism offer valuable resources for this work. Neither provides a complete answer. Together, critically engaged, they help us think better about how to organize society, distribute resources, exercise power, and live together. That's what matters most. Not which thinker was right, but whether we can think well about the problems we face. And if this lecture has helped you think more clearly, critically, and carefully about politics, economics, justice, and freedom, then it has succeeded, regardless of where you ended up in the debate between John Locke and Karl Marx.